Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Without further delay, getting this recording arranged tonight has been a little bit of a process that I think will spare you the details on. But we're coming off of our last episode with our guest George McMillan, which very informative episode, very fun. It was a lot to take in, so I did break it up into two parts. But I'm glad to see you guys enjoyed that. Sometimes it's nice to have the deeper analysis. And with all that being said, we did miss out on some of the, I suppose you could say, news of the week stuff that we do need to round back and get. But once again, George, if you're listening, thank you once again for coming on. We'd love to have you on again at some point in the future to really pick through just the intricacies of a lot of these conflicts and
A lot
finding.
of rich material.
Yes,
It was
absolutely. That's the word I'm looking for. But without further ado, we have a lot of news out of Ukraine, so I think I'll just hand it over to you to get started.
okay. So, battlefront maps. We'll begin with Kursk, because this week the Russians have gained about 10 more percent of the territory that they had lost. So now Ukraine is under 50% of the territory that they had gained. You see the yellow outlines where the Russians are moving. Um, in the blow up, we can see the area that they've taken, which is up in the north. Um, and it's Kruglienkoye. So Kruglienkoye, again, I just want to remind listeners and viewers that Suja is the main prize, right? It's from here that all the forces are amassed. That's where they're going, and there's only one real road going into there. So the next slide gives a topographical view. And you can see that Suja is kind of on a low ground, um, but not the lowest part. There is a river that goes through it, mainly to its west. And so the Russians are going to obviously, what we've noticed for the last year and a half is they always move on the heights and then descend. Uh, there have been times, of course, where they have no choice but to fight on an incline, but usually they try to avoid that. And sometimes this explains why they've taken certain routes and not gone directly towards their target. Uh, the next slide will show you just where the city is situated. I mean, it's a big town. I wouldn't call it a city. There aren't any cities in this area. They're all towns. The other big news that's happening is in Toretsk. So the Russians have made several gains. You can see the outlines in the overall map. They have taken over one of the industrial areas. They've consolidated. They have consolidated. Speaking is difficult. Um, the huge terracotta mounds. You can see that in the blow up. Um, and they're working towards another terracotta mound that you can see that is just north of the area that they've recently taken. Once this terracotta mound is taken, I don't know why I'm calling it Terracon. The Russians call it Terracon, or you can just call it an earth mound. This is a mining town. Um, Once they take that, the other earth mounds won't matter much because there's almost no urbanization and no safe places to hide from once that happens. The next slide after that is a kind of an overview, and I've circled where Toretsk and Chasov Yar are located. So you can see Toretsk is at the bottom of the map, and Chasov Yar is at the top. Now, there's conflicting reports, but it appears that the Ukrainians have managed to push out the Russians or push them half out of the industrial plant that they took over last week. It's contested. I haven't seen any new map updates from 2 days ago, so we'll see. I'm sure by next week we'll get a better understanding. I know that an area just south of of Chasov Yar. The Russians took from there, but uh, it's mostly forests. So because the southern part of Chasov Yar does have a lot of forest, which gives decent cover. Anyways, so let's move to Korekhovo and Pokrovsk, and you can see the recent gains that the Russians have been making around this area. North of Korekhovo and south of Pokrovsk, the Russians made a small gain today. Today they weren't that many, great gains by the Russians, but there have been the last 3-4 days without virtually any gain at all by the Ukrainians. The next map will show you a blow up of the area that they've captured north of Korekhovo, and this is several farmers' fields, a tree line, that kind of thing. The Ukrainians have been pushed out of most of the villages south of Korekhovo um, along that river. I forget what the name of the river. In any case, uh, this last map of this region gives you an idea where the pocket is forming. So at the top, where you see that big gain, that just north of it, about 5-6 kilometers, are the outskirts of Pokrovsk, and below it, in that pocket, inside that pocket, is where Korekhovo is. The Russians have taken about half of Korekhovo. They have taken the industrial sector. Not sorry, they've taken the last of the apartment complexes. What's left now is an industrial sector to the west of the city. The One of the objectives that the Russians will want is to capture the road south of Korekhovo in order to stop any more supplies coming in. Um, Once that happens, Korekhovo is kind of toast. It's the end. Um, so now we move to Velika Novoselovka. And in Velika Novoselovka, you can see that there have been more major gains by the Russians in the last week. And all those towns like Makeyevka have fallen now. That pocket around it is smaller. The eastern side of Velika Novoselovka is still occupied by the Russians. They're on the outskirts there. They've been there for 3 weeks. And if we go to the blow up, we can see um, the area. This is a contested area. The Russians had control over this area 2 weeks ago. The Ukrainians, characteristically, uh, pushed them out, but only for a few days. And now the Russians are back in this area. They've consolidated their gains, and so now the northern supply route that links Velika Novoselovka. There are other supply routes, of course, but the northern one has now been closed by the Russians. Um, yeah, this is Novi Kumar, the town that they have been fighting over. Um, the next slide is an overview of this whole area of southern Donetsk and Zaporozhye. Now, in the far left bottom corner, there was a gain by the Ukrainians. This is an area which we haven't spoken about in months. There was that bridge crossing that the Russians did. And then the next day they retreated. Remember, I said, like, I wonder if this is just to provoke the Ukrainians to spread their forces. The next slide is a blow up. There is some farmland that the Ukrainians took today, as you can see outlined in yellow. And honestly, that is it for the battlefront maps. Now, of course, there's a lot more news to get into because there have been a lot of strikes, as I'm sure you're aware of.
Yes, the ones in Kiev were mind-blowing. I mean, it was probably I was up late, about 1:30 or 2 a.m. Eastern time. I see the notification on Telegram. I check it naturally. I'm not doing much else. and I just see fire across Kiev. Now, to my understanding, there may be more up to date information by the time this comes out. It was one of the SBU buildings that they had hit. That was one of the main targets that they had hit. And this, of course, is after the back and forth with the Western long range missiles. Because, of course, you first have the attacks into Kursk. You have the Orezhnik, which many people consider retaliation for that, but some people question whether that was a separate action by the Russians. And then there was the airfield that was hit, I believe it was in Bryansk. And
I think that
the,
was Rostov.
yes,
I could be
yes,
wrong. There were attack and strikes in Bryansk and Rostov on Don.
yes. And I think there may have been one in Voronezh, but I could be confusing that with another one. That may have been a drone strike, but
That's the drone strike on an oil field, I
yes,
think.
yes, that's the one that's what it was in Voronezh. But with that, many people consider this as the quote unquote retaliation. Putin did actually make some interesting remarks. He was at one of these. He was actually putting on an end of the year conference where it was just a question and answer forum, in essence. And he made comments about how there is a war against what he called the Russian world. And a lot of people have wondered, well, if that's the case, why has there not been stronger response from the Russians? And I think clearly what's happening, and I think what Putin said in his own words, if I could paraphrase, whether you agree or not, is that his enemies, the collective West, if you will, are laying out the bait, and they want Russia to take the bait. They want to play this tit for tat escalation game. They want to bait the Russians into that. And the Russians, once again, we have seen them play into that, sometimes wisely, and sometimes you can question uh, the logic of such moves, but I won't get too far into the details with that. But when it comes to the red lines, the provocations, I do think one thing that has to be taken into consideration is yes, the Ukrainians have the long range missiles. Yes, the Western powers, particularly the Americans, have to help them operate these. But at the end of the day, it does not alter the situation on the front line. The Ukrainian front line continues to recede, morale continues to plummet. The Russians have air superiority. They've demonstrated multiple times just in this past year that they can strike anywhere they want in Ukraine effectively any time that they want. Mainly the missile strikes in late August come to mind, the ones that happened at the crack of dawn. And once again, in terms of Ukrainian gains on the front lines, they have been negligible as a
They're
whole.
non-existent.
No, no, they don't. And whatever small gains they do make, when you look at the net change in territory month by month, ever since the fall of Bakhmut, going all the way back to 2023, in particular Avdiivka this past winter in February, it has been a gradual and actually ever increasing Russian advance. To the point, to quote Jihadi Julian, who I'm sure has a new cause now that Assad is felled, and we're going to get a little bit more into the
Yeah.
Assad stuff, a little bit more in the Middle Eastern stuff, because it's been less than 2 weeks and we're still seeing immense fallout from it. But I'll hold my tongue until then. If the Russians continue at this rate, they'll be in, as he would put it, Kiev. So you got to get all those Y's in there. That reminds me, I got to show that Ben Garrison comic on air when we get to that point because that's pretty good. But he said that if the Russians continue with their current gains, he said this back during the summer, back during July, August, actually right before the Kursk quote unquote counteroffensive, that the Russians would reach Kiev once again, as he would put it, in 2 years. Now, as we see, the rate only increases, and there are a few good channels out there who do a time lapse of certain areas of the front or the entire front as a whole. Some of them go all the way back to 2014. Some of them just start in 2022. You can sense the biases one way or another depending on the source, but like I said, if you do look up some of the time lapses of the map on YouTube in particular, you can find some of them on Telegram as well. There's some pretty interesting stuff you can see, but once again, not since the 2022 counteroffensive have the Ukrainians seen any substantial gains, disregarding Kursk, which I think is a unique situation in and of itself. Not to say
Mhm.
that the Ukrainians didn't accomplish anything in Kursk. I think that they um, definitely won a massive PR victory. I think the reason why we even have the long range missile strikes is because they were able to make that incursion and hold on to it for as long as they have. Now, as you've seen by the maps, it's not going to last much longer. I mean, it's going to hold through the end of the year because
Yeah.
once again, we're less than 2 weeks from the end of the year, but it's not going to hold through the winter. I'll just put it that way. And I'm actually willing to go on record 100% and say that no, the Ukrainians will not be in Kursk by the end of the winter. I don't think that's a possibility at all, no matter what they're able to uh, pull out of their hat at last minute. But with all that being said, it is a seemingly unstoppable uh, Russian war machine. And
Yeah.
a lot of people are, I think, coming to that conclusion. You're seeing murmurs of that in Europe. You're seeing, of course, with the incoming Trump administration and the waffling going back and forth, though, of course, they're going to propose the best peace plan that has ever been put to paper, like they did with the Abraham Accords, of course. But I think we all have a much more sober view of how much more of a muddled process it's going to look like. And I'll get into some of the stuff with Europe when I get into the questions of Hungary, Gazprom. I'll talk about NATO and Trump's recent statements regarding that when once we get past some of the bulk of Ukraine. But Zelensky, once again, he oscillates, he waffles, he goes back and forth talking about, oh, maybe it is time. Maybe we need to accept that some aspects of complete 1991 borders are unrealistic. But then having the bizarre conference where he says, "Oh, Putin just likes to kill. Putin's a dumbass." His words, not mine. And like I said, in this very bizarre, and remember when the media at least claimed this man did not speak a word of English back in 2019 when the first Trump impeachment trial was going on, where they would constantly repeat the footage of him meeting with Trump in 2018, 2019, of Trump saying something about one of the Hunter Biden investigations, and Zelensky didn't really look like he knew what was going on. Which, once again, number one, even if he didn't speak that good of English at the time, that's what the translator and the translation earpieces are for. So I don't know. I think given everything that has happened with Ukraine since the first Trump impeachment, I think there does deserve to be a retrospective. Now, whether we will be the ones to do that, who knows? We'll see what we can get to. Definitely, obviously, not in this episode, but at some point in the future, I think that would be interesting to look back on actually a lot of these strange events during Trump's first term and really look at them in light of everything that we know now and with the way events have developed since. But to turn to more substantial news, beyond just
If
speculating.
I could,
Yeah, please go ahead.
yeah. So I just wanted to say a few things about the strikes because one of the things that the Ukrainians do when things aren't going well, and just before I get into that, in Kursk, I saw no less than two or three videos just this week of Ukrainian POWs that have been captured that have admitted either they have done it or somebody in their battalion or troop or platoon has admitted that they killed civilians. So today, one of the guys pointed out a member in his battalion that killed two elderly people. But it's this kind of shit, right? Um, there was a HIMARS attack on Donetsk city, and I think it was also another one in Bydyansk in the south in Zaporozhye. Now, that one killed five people, right? But again, it's this kind of acting out, and I think by now it's obvious, right? The Ukrainian strategy is not going. It is going to be to basically they're giving up territory in hopes of burning out the Russian forces and going for some really big thing. Obviously, Kursk, there were many reasons for it, and especially why did the British help them do this? Part of it is of course, mainly it's a PR stunt. It's there for low information Westoids to grab onto some kind of hope. It's also for the troops to take out revenge on senior citizens, um, who really, obviously, these people can't. They're not fighting you. They're terrified. with weak health and so on and so on. So, but there's more than one reason why they did this. Uh, Obviously, they think they can use it as a bargaining chip. We've discussed that. Zelensky has admitted it. He denied the Kursk thing, taking over the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, that really would have given them tremendous leverage, right? Everything I've just said would have been multiplied by 10 if they had achieved that. And so now they've lost 60% of the territory that they held, which grew at its peak in September. And gradually since then, they've been losing it. The most amount of troops right now that are amassed that we know of, and underlined know of, are still in the Sumy and Kursk region. So they're determined to stay there, or at least prioritize Kursk. There are rumors, however, that the Ukrainians plan on another offensive in the middle of winter. And remember, I've been saying on the show that, where is the Rasputitsa, right? Like, it's not that muddy, and you see videos now, and there's no in Pokrovsk. This is a colder winter than the last two, right? Well, I mean, in 2022, really, like, it started almost at the end of winter. It started a month before the end of winter, but um, the winter of 2022, 2023, however, was quite mild and quite muddy as a result. So the rumor is that they're going to make a push in Zaporozhye again, right? Obviously, they're counting on that there are fewer Russian troops there than in Pokrovsk, but it could also be that in this war, one of the things that we've noticed is that there are very competent commanders and not very competent commanders. We've many times lauded the special efforts and strategy of the Ukrainian general, whoever he is, who's in charge of defending the Seversk region north of Bakhmut, right? Because the Russians made some gains, then they were stopped, and to a lesser extent, Turney, but um, you could argue that who's ever in charge of the Russian forces around Pokrovsk has done an amazing job, because really it has just been one success after another moving forward. Yes, this war is a very bloody war. Both sides lose a lot of material because, frankly, a lot of these armored vehicles and tanks are very susceptible to just drone attacks. The first drone attack isn't going to destroy it, but eventually they will.
Oh,
And that,
absolutely.
right? Um, so anyways,
Well, on the
the,
word of successful Ukrainian commanders, I think we need to bring up probably the most successful one in light of recent news.
mm,
That is Budanov, and he's not even a frontline commander.
yes,
But
yeah, we'll get to
yes,
Kirillov. Yeah,
yes.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. So what I would say is, I mean, the Russians in November were gaining 22 and a half kilometers square kilometers a day, and now they're at roughly 38 or 39 square kilometers a day for December, right? There's no muddy season. The muddy season is over, right? The Russians made the most amount of gains in what should have been the height of muddy season, the Rasputitsa. And now what we have is the ground is going to freeze over more. There'll be less cover in the tree lines, yes, but it will be easier for tracked vehicles in particular to move. And the Ukrainians, let's say that this new counteroffensive somewhere else. I can't see them trying Zaporozhye again. I think that's a feint. I could be wrong, but I would suspect that they would try something else in another area of the front in the north. The question is, how many forces do the Russians have up there? The forces in Kursk, I think, on both sides, they appear equal. Um, and of course, we are seeing headlines, in the Economist that the amount of um, military men abandoning their posts is higher than it was in total for all of 2022 and all of 2023. It's something like 8 times higher. And so, of course, they still have enough. They still have enough, but these are conscripts that are doing this, right? These are people who are dragged off the street, and essentially to their death. So, um, so the strategy of the Ukrainians so far, moving forward, is still that they are going to try to hold on to Kursk. Zelensky says he's going to hold on till January the 20th, and then he's going to withdraw. I mean, we'll see. Because that's when Blumph gets sworn in.
No,
But
yeah, I realize that, but the reason I laugh, and perhaps it's a little morbid, is that he constantly does these things where he demands the impossible of his troops to hold these positions until some PR date could be reached, whether that's the Olympic closing ceremony or his visit to
yeah,
the UN. And this
yeah,
has happened time and time and time again, or his
yeah.
visit to whatever European vassal he's going to go beg to give more aid so they can request it from the Americans so Zelensky can get it. But, and,
It's a
uh,
question of psychological warfare. And when
yes,
we get to the
yes.
Kirillov thing, the difference in psychological warfare between the Russians and the Americans is going to be revealed. And their psychological warfare, of course, has been to divide the Russian public, right? They can't win on the field, right? The field, like, you're going to use the territory, you're going to lose it in order to burn through as many Russian forces as you can. I mean, they're losing more. And in fact, there was another exchange of the dead today, 503 to 42. Okay, that's over a 10-to-1 ratio. This is the third ratio where we're seeing anywhere from 1 to 5 to 1 to 10. This one's more like 1 to 11.5. So, enormous deficits in these ratios for the Ukrainian side. So, anyways, they have to keep the morale up of the West. They have to keep the like, it's an illusion, right? We're in Russia, we invaded Russia, and at the same time, it's there to also add morale to his troops and the population. And of course, the number one target, of course, is to demoralize the Russian population. Like, part of the reason they're killing senior citizens and children in Kursk is because they want to demoralize the public, right? In a way, it's a misjudgment of character, right? Because the Ukrainians are used as a kind of proxy, a stand-in for Russians by the Americans in terms of understanding their psychology, right? That their desire for a better life is so strong, right? That they'll go along with any promise, right? That is the number one value. You can sacrifice yourself for that, but you shouldn't sacrifice yourself for other things. And so there's an assumption that the Russians must be the same way. That's why you had the Crocus Small terrorist attack. That's why you have in Dagestan, those guys who killed all those cops
And even going
before they.
back earlier in the war, the border incursions into Bryansk and Belgorod, where
Yes.
you that was probably the first signs of this. Even though, if you want
Yep.
to go even further back, of course, there was the Odessa attacks. There was
Yep.
everything that has happened in the Donbass since 2014, even before the separatist movements took up arms, ever since the Maidan, really. But I do agree that it certainly has intensified this past year. I think Crocus was really the defining moment of that, and then, as you said, Dagestan, the thwarted assassination attempt on Putin during the uh, Russian Naval Day celebration. That was actually back in July, only a few days apart from the first Trump assassination attempt as well. That was an operation that Budanov had called off, and it that also, if you want to get into it, if the Ukrainian
Hmm.
intelligence was
Hmm.
involved in Fico's assassination attempt, and also if they were
Yep.
involved in the multiple thwarted assassination attempts against Orban.
Yep. Yeah. So, I guess we should talk about Kirillov then. So Kirillov was a high-profile general in the Russian military. Now, he's not a general in the sense that he commands troops, right? He's not one of those kind of generals. He was in charge of basically nuclear weapons, bioweapons, hazardous
WMDs,
material,
so to speak.
WMDs. Yes. So, and he's also the one who essentially outlined what was going on in the 42 American biolabs that were created there, and so, of course, they were creating all kinds of bird flu, and we've discussed on the show how it's most likely that the Americans are the ones that planted all those um, avionic viruses in food supplies in China throughout the 2000s, and they're probably the ones behind Wuhan, anyways. So um,
Actually, Ron Unz has a good series about that. If anyone's
he
interested
does.
in picking their way through that, I would certainly recommend it.
Yeah, yeah, it's the most thorough breakdown I've ever heard, and the telltale signs of that ABC interview with the FBI agents really gave the game away. What they were doing in October and November, prior to that is what the Americans were doing when they went to visit Wuhan. Anyhow, um, so he's the guy who broke all these stories, and he was assassinated, and now so was his assistant. And it was done, I think, by an Uzbek, a 29-year-old Uzbek, who was he was promised, I think, something like, what was it, 150,000 or $1 million or hundred thousand
It
dollars
it
or
was some amount that is much smaller than you would have expected, and we see this happen time and time again. Going back to the Crocus guys, going back to these guys in Dagestan who did this, where it's these Uzbeks, it's these Tajis, it's these Kyrgyz. As far as I've never Kazakhs. It seems like they are the ones who are actually exempt from that, who go in and partake in these attacks, and you'll also notice a disproportionate amount of these people who join groups like Al Qaeda, like ISIS, who fight in Syria, fight in Iraq, fight in Afghanistan. All these places where the proxy wars need to take place, they're always on the ground. And
Mhm.
uh, look, I don't necessarily blame the governments of a lot of these Central Asian countries for expediting these people out of their country. If I was in the position of the Tajiks or the Uzbeks, I would be eager to get these people out of my country as well. But once again, we are seeing, much like, there's actually a lot of cases of this around the world where they are taking the refuse of their society and dumping it on everyone else. And
Yep.
that's, while Russia, I would actually argue, and not out of any bias, but just objectively speaking, while is certainly nowhere near as bad as the Western countries, they still do suffer from this. Now, to their credit, there have been substantial corrective measures taken on both a government and a societal level since Crocus, especially. But once again, it still is a glaring problem, and this will likely continue. The fact that you have these people who have no real loyalty to the Russian Federation, they're there on temporary visas, they're there on work visas, and a lot of them are motivated by money. Some people are motivated by maybe ideological or religious reasons, and they're also, let's be honest, quite stupid, and can be very easily talked into doing these kind of things.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Now, his driver survived, but as I said, Kirillov and his um, his assistant were killed. Now, the thing is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, like this general, of course, he'd go for meetings, but he was kind of semi-retired, according to um, Peter Laval and George Chimioli of the Gaggle. In any case, he's not. He's like he is not a. He's not that kind of a general, right? Now, it was peculiar and telling that the Ukrainians claimed that he was responsible for use of poisonous gas against Ukrainian troops. This is nonsense. This is tear gas that
He
the
must
Russian
have given
troops
it
have.
to the Assad government as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, this is this isn't the kind of nerve agent, the stuff that we saw in Bakhmut in the winter of 2023 when you saw Russian soldiers, that one Russian soldier who's drowning in this puddle because of the gas. He cannot lift himself out. Like, that's not that. Okay, it's literally the typical Ukrainian projection, right? Because they have a stupid captive Westoid audience that just laps this stuff up if they choose to care. And so this is tear gas. That is what is used to get some of these Ukrainians out of the trenches, right? And in fact, they're doing it basically like to persuade them to give up instead of getting killed, because like you would rather have the tear gas than like the grenades being thrown into the hole that you're in. So anyways, they accused them.
Gas, it's a crowd control weapon, something that police use on civilian protesters in every country. This is not. It's not sarin gas. It's not. It's not mustard gas. It's not any of that. It's not chlorine gas. You can go down a list of different chemical and biological weapons. It is a
Yeah,
crowd control device, and
yeah.
like I said, if they can use it against civilian protesters, um, I'm not justifying it one way or another. The idea that it would be used in trench warfare really, in my opinion, isn't that much of a stretch.
Right, right. And so obviously this was an excuse that was fabricated in the night before, right? And it's a morale boost. Again, it's there to pick up the morale of the Westoids and the Ukrainians, right? They've been reading for 2 months now that Kursk isn't going so well. They haven't been able to stop the Russians from gaining territory in Donetsk, and including that transitional area and Velika Novoselovka and Ugledar fell. We shouldn't forget Ugledar was a major turning point. Um, and so they need this, right? They need this pick me up. But then we come back to the issue of psychology, and I mean, I think also a lot of Russians, but a lot of people are, why are the Russians not doing more? Like, why aren't you taking them out now? Let's remember that in 2023 the Russians did attack the SBU headquarters in Kiev. They annihilated that building, and Budanov survived, but Budanov did go to the hospital. Budanov was injured, and so was Zaluzhny. So I mean, it didn't work, but they did try. Now, but Russia, all that said, Russia doesn't try to assassinate these guys. They still want to win this war as the good guy. Now, if you
Yes, and their
look at,
hands are much more tied in
yeah,
international sense because
it's
the
not like
Ukrainians,
Israel.
yeah, the Ukrainians and especially the Israelis will always be backed by the hilt, by America especially, and then of course all of America's vassal states. Whereas we've seen cases where Russia does have to tiptoe around several issues in order to appease both China and India. Not to say that their entire war effort is reliant on China and India, but in terms of the economic growth they've enjoyed and the growth in BRICS, it has been a matter of walking very carefully around their interests as well, because you recall it was all over the press that Putin went to the Beijing Olympics to get Xi's blessing to actually launch the special military operation because China has so much tied up in Ukraine. Now, while the way the media portrayed that is blatantly false, it is true that the Chinese have invested billions upon billions in Ukraine over the past 20 years, past 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union, and that a Russian operation would have to take that in consideration if they are looking to build a stronger partnership, especially an economic partnership with China. Certain guarantees would have to be made, certain agreements would have to be made if you want to keep the Chinese in your good graces. And once again, while Russia and China are on very good terms right now, and I don't foresee that splintering for the foreseeable future, I think it would take a massive rift, and I think it would take a major realignment in America in order for something like that to be triggered. Something that is just so far out of the question, I don't think it's worth considering for the next, I would say, few decades at least. I could be
Yeah,
wrong about that, but that's my general assessment of the situation. Um, but you do have to recall, just a few decades ago, talking 1960s, 70s, 80s during the Cold War, China had no problem siding against the Soviet Union. Now, it was a much different world back then, but it has been shown before that the Americans and the Chinese have once before aligned themselves against the Russians or the Soviet Union at that time. But
Mm.
it does show that that sort of alignment of powers is possible. Now, given the current global climate, I don't think that is the case.
Yeah,
But
and
there is
economically,
precedence for it, I will say.
right, economically, the biggest predictor that that won't happen is the gradual severing of economic ties between China and America. So you go back to like 2012, 2014. What was it? Something like 10 to 13% of Chinese GDP is trade with America. And it's less than 3% now. It's like two. It's actually 2%. So what's in it for China? China fully understands that, like, you know, they don't, in a way, they don't need America as much as they used to. They've already begun to adapt, and this is why hostile language towards China has only increased in the last 10 years, right? Beginning with Obama, all the islands. The truth is, they're all making these islands. They're not just China.
There's a
So,
reason Trump was allowed to start his trade war.
right, right,
Would have
exactly.
never
And
happened 20 years ago. Would have never happened even 10 years before Trump.
absolutely, absolutely. So I don't think they're not going to sever them. There's nothing that they can give them now. To go back to Kirillov, the Russians are, it like, if they say that they're going to do a strike, it'll just be something that was already on their timetable to do, right? They did that before with the previous attacks. Now, um, as you already said, they have hit Kiev. They've hit this section called a Toronto section.
They
I,
just
I
can't help themselves.
I know, but I think I know why it's called a Toronto section. The design of the buildings. Anyone who's familiar with Toronto, around King Street, let's say King, west of University, but before Spadina, or I should say Spadina. That's how we actually say it. There's a building that was constructed there, and I know the architectural firm that designed it. And the buildings I saw around this Toronto section of Kiev, where things were blown up, looks incredibly familiar. It's like that late '80s, early '90s style of architecture. So, yes. So, anyways, and there was an SBU headquarters that the Russians did hit. Now, uh, I was surprised that Budanov was actually in the building when they struck it a year ago. I would be even more surprised if he was in the building, because I think, after that attack, there's no way that he can afford to be in such an obvious place, right? Obviously, the Russians want to lull them into a false sense of confidence. Like, they'll allow Schultz and I don't know, Macron to visit Kiev, but they're not going to be so sparing with Budanov. And the Russians have taken out various officers and generals, but not as high profile as Kirillov. And again, they did injure Zaluzhny, but he did survive that attack. So, but he might have been injured in the attack that the Russians did in Kupiansk. In any case, the Russians are still going to go with, like, the good guy attitude. They're not going to, uh, bomb the smithereens out of Kiev, or, like, basically do what Israel did in Lebanon and Gaza. They're going to kind of do what they've been doing, and that's going to frustrate a lot of people. I think the West is counting on this frustrating the Russian population, right? No,
Yeah,
everything has a breaking point, but you would think Kursk is a breaking point, right? Because there are hundreds of civilians that their whereabouts are not certain, right? Um, would Ukrainians be involved in death camps again? It's possible. So
now I just did want to comment on that in terms of Russia's quote unquote well, red lines, its relationship to Ukraine, and why it just hasn't flattened the country. And we've discussed this a number of times, and I think number one, it's obvious why they wouldn't flatten Kiev because they do still see some cultural and civilizational value to it. Not that I think that they plan on annexing the city or the surrounding territory, but in some sort of future arrangement, some sort of tentative arrangement, I do think they imagine that when this war is over, when they get their quote unquote neutral Ukraine minus whatever territory is ceded to Russia. Also, that's another point that both Putin and Medvedev brought up, that annexation of further territory is on the table. That, yes, they do want that to be intact. They do want that to be part of the larger Russian world, even if it is not part of the Russian state itself. But to address the point of what a lot of people have said, well, why don't they just flatten Lvov or Ivano-Frankivsk or any of these Western Ukrainian cities, these Galician cities that they will never set foot in because there's simply too much resistance? Well, I think the answer should be obvious with that. Uh, if, and I've said it many times before, if the Russians did even a tenth of what the Israelis did, they would have a NATO coalition on their doorstep, even if it was not direct intervention. The idea for Macron's little expeditionary forces or the peacekeeping forces that the European Union is trying to put together, I think popularity for that would skyrocket overnight if there actually was that kind of destruction and devastation where they just did start flattening apartment blocks and even just Lvov, not even talking about Kiev, but even in the far western reaches of Ukraine, that the Russians simply cannot afford that kind of escalation and it wouldn't benefit them in the slightest. And,
it would
and then
it would
there's also the
it
question.
would divide Russian society.
Yes,
It would divide Russian society, and they have a shared history, and they live next door.
yes.
It isn't like America, killing about 1,000 people a week in the initial invasion of Iraq,
Well,
or as you say, Israel. Um,
I was actually
there
just, I
there are
was
different considerations, but the thing is the Russians doing this good guy attitude is what has convinced all these other third world countries basically to stick by Russia's side.
yes, and you actually brought up both points that I was going to, so I'll just add a little bit onto that. With the question of Western Ukraine, Galicia, Lvov, there is still that question of what will Russia's future relationship be with that part of the Slavic world as it was. Are we going to try to reconcile with these people post war? Are we going to keep them as part of an independent Ukrainian state? Are we actually going to try to draw them back in instead of having them be the same spearhead they've been against us for about 300 years at that point, us being the Russians in that case? Uh, but once again, as we saw, is there going to be at some sort of attempt? And I wouldn't exactly call them pro-Russian sentiments, but there have been people with much more relaxed attitudes about Russia in parts of Western Ukraine. It's not unheard of, even though it is culturally dominated by the heart of Ukrainian nationalism. There still is a breakthrough there, and mind you, you had the Soviet Union in place, which that's really when that territory came under the control of at least a Moscow-based government. How Russian it was, once again, you can get in that debate. I'm not going to get into that right now, but they were under the same polity for a better part of the 20th century, and there still are ties there. It's not a completely alien people. It's not a complete foreign people. Yes, the history is contentious, very much so. But I do think, at least as far as the Russians are concerned, this is an area that at some point they can make inroads in. But if they just start treating this like, say, Israel treats Gaza or America treated Iraq, or like it is some sort of colonial adventure, then it's simply not going to happen. And as you said, with the other parts of the world, the non-Western world, whether it be the African countries, the Middle Eastern countries, parts of East Asia, sympathy for I'm not saying support would drop off, but sympathy for Russia and their military operation and the way that they have meticulously crafted the narrative to present to this part of the world about it being a special military operation, about it being an operation of liberation, of stamping out radicalism in the Kiev government. A lot of that would lose credibility in the eyes of these people. And I don't think it's necessary for Russia's survival. But once again, the reason why Russia has enjoyed such tremendous economic growth, the reason why they have enjoyed a resurgence as a great power in this world, is because they have been able to carefully work their way around the diplomatic situations,
Hmm.
um, in
Yeah,
particularly the
yeah,
Middle East and Africa, and to a lesser
yeah.
extent Asia.
Yeah, let's not forget that in the first 6 months, I mean, I will tell you, and I have on the show, but in the first 3 months of this war, I really didn't know what was going to happen, with in particular concern with the Russian economy, and what would all these other states do. And so, in many ways, Israel played a very important role, um, in that they proved like it proved the hypocrisy of America in a way that you haven't seen since post Vietnam, the invasion of Iraq. It's on that level. The West, it has changed, because really there cannot be any kind of dissenting view, right? We've discussed this on the show before. The West is in a very different mode. They don't have the luxury for any kind of debate anymore, right? Um, because they feel threatened, right? Notice that Putin gave his press conference. He allows these losers from the West, especially the Jewish guy for BBC, and the British guy for NBC
Well, there was
News.
the entertaining one of the German he scolded for not asking him the question in German.
Right. But I'm talking about the one that the yes, yes, but the one from yesterday. And Putin pointed out, he said, Russian journalists cannot ask you any questions at all in the West. So what he's demonstrating for the world is, I'm going to look confident. I'm going to make you look like hypocrites. You're the ones that are going to look weak, right? You're going to look like the Soviets,
Yes, and I know he's not
afraid of
exactly.
dissent, afraid of debate, afraid to receive any questions framed in a harsh way, right?
Yes.
And we're not. And I'm not going to trip over myself. So that is what endears him. Like, of course, I'm not like a Putin shill. Like, there's he said totally asinine things like, well, we went to Syria to stop terrorists from taking over the state. Well, I mean, it's literally what happened. Not that Russia was ever going to commit huge forces there, but when we'll get into Syria, because I have shocking news, anyways, about what happened. But it, he should have started this war much sooner. He mentioned that. Now, he says that he doesn't smile and laugh as much as he used to, and so on and so on. I mean, he's a diplomat also. In any case, I think it goes a long way. I find it irritating. Like, if it were me, I'd give the Zhirinovsky treatment. I'd kick these guys out. I don't know. I'd humiliate them. I'd humiliate them and tell them to go. I'd spray them with I don't know, a water gun or something, and tell them to get the f out. Right? Like, um, but he won't do that. He won't do that. And like I say, it bothers me. I'm one of those people that I'm bothered by. Right? But you know, um, Russia doesn't have the world reserve currency. It can't just print money out of nothing over and over and over again, and it's much more hamstrung that way. So it has
Yes.
to play with the cards that it has.
And to build on your point, putting aside one's personal opinion, it is an overall strategy for Russia's public image the right move. The fact that Putin is willing to sit down and have these interviews and take these questions. Once again, has any Western leader been able to demonstrate that kind of stamina to go head to head with journalists in general. I mean, you even watch some of the press conferences just from some of the more coherent heads of state. And once again, we're putting Biden out of the question because that shouldn't even be a topic of discussion. I mean, they're always very entertaining because Trump is a very
Hmm.
entertaining man by nature. Um, but in terms of actual substantive uh, discussion, you do see that out of Putin, whether you agree with him or not. And like you said, there's a lot of areas where you can find what he says just to be wholly insufficient, depending on your point of view. Or I suppose you could take the Macron approach and say that your thoughts are too complex for journalists. What happened to that, Macron? Yeah, no, we're stuck with the other one. But point being is, Putin does demonstrate himself, love him or hate him, or even for those people who don't necessarily hate him, but find his course of action, say,
Yeah.
lacking, as you were sort of discussing. It does demonstrate that he is a competent man at his job, that he is able to field these questions, he is able to explain his actions, he's able to walk people through all these things, and that actually returns to the Tucker Carlson interview. I know a lot of people thought it was very in depth. Now, we had mentioned when we did our initial thoughts on it back in the beginning of the year that we pretty much knew all this, so it wasn't really news to us.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
didn't
yeah.
really seem that meaty to us, but I can understand why somebody who's out of the loop with that kind of stuff might find it that way. But once again, it's a man who's able to sit down and give a timeline of his nation's history, and also talk to great extent about contemporary issues, link them back together, and make his case using that. Once again, find me somebody else in the Western world who could do that at this point. Who do you think the last American president who could do that? Probably, in my estimation, Bush Sr. is probably the last person who's been in the White House who could have done
Hmm.
anything approximating that, and even that's
I
a bit of a
agree with you.
stretch.
I agree. I think that's very insightful because what I was just about to say is, a lot of these other societies, that are referred to as the global South, they're much more traditional societies. So the idea of a president, right, or a king, is a kind of surrogate father figure, like the other father figure. Okay, very dominant in human history, right? This other figure, which the West is focused on getting rid of. This is why they can't stand leaders with a lot of charisma. And so the thing that you find, you know, um, like I would say, Clinton, um, Obama sometimes, definitely, Biden, like they look like managers,
Yes,
not a
absolutely.
boss, managers. And many other leaders, like let's say Trudeau in Canada, um, a whole plethora of European leaders, really they only appear as somebody who is being, they're interviewed for a job, a potential employee. They're always the face of the oligarchs in the West, and they always talk like this. And because in many ways the West does not want to leave it to chance of a leader making decisions that, like, oligarchs in the West would be unhappy with,
And to
right?
further on your point with that, in terms of a figure who is a patriarch to the nation, as it were, or somebody who does have that transcendent presence, versus, like you said, the middle managers, where it feels like Bill Clinton could be your supervisor at any given corporation, as it were, especially
Yeah.
Barack Obama in that case. And let's not even get into Trudeau or those kind of people because that's an entirely different thing altogether. But once again, we saw this. And I would say the last real defining French president who commanded that is obviously going to be De Gaulle. There were some remnants of that in some of the later office holders, but once again, look what happened to him. He was practically removed from office. And
Hmm.
you can go through with European leaders, really around the 60s, 70s, sometimes the 80s if you're lucky. Those transcendent figures were cast aside. I think the most obvious case of this are probably Franco and Salazar, both in the 70s, being kicked out of power or the regimes falling apart shortly after their death, in the case of
Yeah.
Franco, as it were, where you're right. They don't want to chance it. They don't want to have that sort of
It
transcendent
kind of
figure who
begins
can
with
speak to
Kennedy.
an age. Yeah, oh, absolutely. I would.
It kind of begins with Kennedy. Enormous charisma. The country is divided. Okay, you find the same articles about all of the right wingers and so on and so on. Um, even back then in the early '60s, but he's replaced by Lyndon Johnson. Really, uh, no, completely forgettable. Nixon, of course, for guys like us, we like him. He but he's not charismatic. He's not charismatic. He's not liked. Gerald Ford, Carter, uh, Reagan is. I mean, he's a goofy grandpa.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's
like so you have George Bush Senior. Really, George Bush Junior is like he's always going to be the boss's son, and he's
it's always going
so
to scream nepotism. He's never going to be taken
nepotism.
seriously.
Yes, and so yeah, I don't want to, anyways, I thought I'd bring that up, but that
No,
isn't to
I'm
say
glad. I'm glad
I'm
you brought
happy
that up.
with like with Putin. We've gone, I've gone about on about that on previous shows, but I just thought it would be something worth pointing out because, like, if you're like me and you want to see him do some really badass strikes and stuff, he's not going to do it. Like, I mean, hitting Kiev, I think him hitting in the center of Kiev is already something that he doesn't want to do. He'd rather go for another, places like Odessa are like they're all working, on generators. They don't have any power. Um, so, is he going to take out another substation and all that, right? So he did a little more after these latest round of attacks and Storm Shadows. But I mean, I really was hoping for another Oreshnik strike because it just looked so awesome.
But I think the last story I have about Ukraine as a whole, which will lead into some of the European news, is that the Ukrainians do say, we'll see if it actually follows through, that they're going to cease the transit of Russian gas to Europe, Russian oil and gas to
Yes.
Europe through the
Yep.
pipelines starting in 2025. I believe it was
January 1st
Schmidhal, the
at
prime
7
minister,
a.m.
yes, came out and said that those contracts, when they expire, they are not going to be renewed, obviously. And that puts Europe once again in a very precarious situation, especially the holdouts in Europe, because we saw the situation with Hungary and Slovakia in particular, who are very intertwined into the Russian pipeline network, where there was murmurs of this in September. There was a temporary stoppage of it in September, for those of you who remember, and it caused chaos. And I know right now one of the big moves of the NGOs of the European Union is coming down to bear on Orban. And that you have this figure, Peter Magyar. Once again, that name just kills me every time I hear it. Yeah, Peter the Hungarian is our color revolution leader. It's Peter Hungarian. I,
Yeah.
I can't get over it. I'm sorry, but once again, he enjoys a very high level of popularity, and a lot of that has been maintaining relative economic stability compared to the rest of Europe throughout the course of the 2022 Russo-Ukrainian war. And if energy transit is really halted to the extent that the Ukrainians are saying it is, that could cause severe ramifications not only in Hungary but also in Hungary's closest allies, such as Slovakia, is one of them, and then that could also cascade over into Serbia in the following months, which already has teetered with some political instability following the re-election of Vucic, and just all the surrounding issues with that. And Orban, who is trying to build this Eurosceptic within Brussels coalition, it's a very bizarre concept, but it makes sense tactically. Where he is reaching out to the Romanians, and once again the Romanians, where they just screwed over Georgescu, where he is trying to build bridges with the Serbs who aren't even within the European Union, as well as the other Balkan states, some of the populist movements in the Czech Republic. I can't remember the name of the opposition leader there, it escapes me, but certainly Fico in Slovakia, and then even some elements in Western Europe, such as the AfD, which we'll get into when we talk about some of the news out of Germany. Um, Elements of National Rally in France, and even some of the Italian right wing populist movements. This coalition that he's trying to build, if the energy, uh, what are effectively energy sanctions against Hungary via Ukraine, do take effect, and this does cascade into growing economic content, especially in Hungary, it could shatter that entire coalition because once again, Orban has been the standard bearer of Euroscepticism within Europe without leaving it,
Hmm.
like what the British did, for almost a decade now. He's been doing this since 2015. He's been the one who built the wall. He's been the one railing against migration, the one railing against this disastrous foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia with the European Union. And although Hungary is a small country, it's not very relevant in the grand scheme of things. He is very much a towering figure who is able to coordinate a lot of these movements across the continent into something that could potentially be an actual counterbalance. Now, once again, because of setbacks in other countries, he hasn't managed to build a strong coalition, but there are still the makings of that coalition. Like I said, I just discussed all the elements across Europe that could potentially align with him, and it looks like that could be undone if he is unseated. And I think it's not so much about Hungary being a distant state within the European Union because once again, it's a small landlocked country of 10 million people. There's not much it can do. Sure, it does have pipelines. It is somewhat strategic in that regard, but when it comes to really what it is the fact that Orban is able and Fidesz as a whole are able to command that presence where they can more or less be organizers for the continental populist right, for lack of a better term, which makes him the grand prize if they want to take anyone down.
My fear is this: all the big countries, France, Germany, Britain, even countries like Italy, Denmark, Spain, they have ways because they're not landlocked to get gas and oil. And we see what the West is struggling with in Georgia. Uh, the I don't know what's the protests are. They're either dead or they're not. Like, it's not much happening. The 28th is the deadline. We're 1 week away where Zorabishvili is gonna have to leave. They've already put sanctions on people wishing to travel to the EU from Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. They're rage quitting right now. So, but what happens if where is a country like Slovakia and Hungary and Serbia? Where are they going to get their gas? I know there's routes through Turkey. I think Serbia could be it because of Blue Stream and South Stream going through Turkey. This could be an arrangement because we'll get into Syria. Obviously, Erdogan wants to expand, but he also wants that region quiet. Israel wants Syria in permanent chaos, like Libya and Iraq, and balkanized. These are two very different wishes, and one of the reasons the Russians haven't left Syria is because I think there are various players there, even at odds with one another, that want Russia to play some kind of mitigating role. In any case, so I just wonder if Washington and Brussels want to strangle guys like Fico and Orban by denying them this gas, and of course forcing them to give electricity to Zelensky, which is what is the current state right now. And of course, there's a row now between Orban and Zelensky because Orban dared to call for a Christmas truce, just one day. And he's so eloquent about it. It's not much, but you know what? One day where we don't have any fighting is a day where thousands of men will at least be able to go home for that one. At least they'll have Christmas. At least they'll have that one day. where fewer men will be killed. Um, an exchange of 700 for 700 prisoners of war, right? And this set Zelensky off. I mean, Zelensky has been bad mouthing him, calling him, short of a traitor, over and over again. And Orban again today reiterates these are European values. These are Christian values. This is what Europe is about. He's making that distinction between, the secularization of of Europe vis-a-vis the EU and American dominance, and going back to an older idea. I'm not advocating for the disastrous wars that we Europeans fought. We had Christmas truces. Okay, I mean we killed each other in the millions. There is a limit to this, to my praise of Orban, but nonetheless, I think that would be good. But of course, Zelensky can't have any of it.
No, it's just beyond the pale. It's beyond the question. There is no room for truce. There's no room for compromise. And we saw this back when Hungary assumed incumbency of the EU presidency, where he did set the agenda, and one of his main foreign policy objectives was brokering peace between Russia and Ukraine. And he even went to Ukraine first to meet with Zelensky
Hmm.
before going to Russia. And that meeting fell through in what, less than 24 hours?
Yeah.
I think he only ended up staying 12 hours. But point being is, Zelensky has never reciprocated to seemingly the one man in Europe, the one government in Europe that actually has any real interest in brokering a long-term solution to this conflict. And you can criticize the specifics of that. But what Orban has said since day one, and mind you, he voted for the initial sanctions packages. That's the reason it got through the European Union, is because the
Yep.
Hungarians did assent to that. And since 2014, the Hungarians, while it hasn't been much, they have contributed military aid to Ukraine since the annexation of Crimea. Now, that has since ceased, especially post 2022. But all this to say that, and this would have been Orban's government. I think Fidesz was in power in 2014. I can't recall exactly, but it was around that time.
Yeah.
But point being is, it should dispel the notion that Hungary, Orban, is pro Russia. But they have an understanding of what politics looks like on continental Europe. The fact that the Russians are indeed a player, and that no, they are not going to be destroyed, they're not going to fold in on themselves like a house of cards. So therefore, there must be a level of cooperation. And you can talk about the territorial disputes, you can talk about who should get what in Ukraine. But the point he always comes back to is because I've listened to a few interviews with them, they're always really good, where right or wrong, this is reality, and we need to work towards a long-lasting solution. Maybe we might have to make some concessions to the Russians, but I think any sane person would accept that in the name of peace and cooperation, which I think, once again, should be the standard line in Europe. That should be the default opinion. But what do I know? But once again, you get this hammering on throughout Europe, across the political spectrum, of no compromises, aid Ukraine, fight to the last Ukrainian, back them to the hilt until what the entire country just dies off and the Russians win anyway. What is the delusion of victory here? And like you said, I think it is in large part an effort to strangle out the Hungarians between the pressure put on them from Brussels and then on the other side from the energy shortage that could be imposed. And then there's the element of Donald Trump. What is Trump's administration going to do? I mean, mind you, that Pompeo, and look, I know Pompeo is a figure in and of himself, but was part of the first Trump administration, whether knowingly or unknowingly, that Trump was organizing protests in Hungary with the NGOs against Orban in 2018 and in
Yep.
2020, I believe. But point being is he organized multiple protests against Orban. At least the State Department did under his watch. And like I said, how far up the chain of command did that go? But point being is, there was likely a way they could have pulled the plug on that at some point.
Mhm.
And then Trump's waffling back and forth, where he is demanding that NATO members spend up to 5% GDP to to military spending.
They can
Uh,
barely do 2%. He's
no,
asking them
yeah,
to
they
more
barely
than
can.
double it.
And I don't know. Is this an argument? Is Trump an accelerationist? Is he trying to implode?
For
That
the EU.
that that might be the play. Who knows?
I love
One
it.
can only hope. but but with that being said, uh, I know that Orban has made great efforts to be in contact with Trump since even before he got elected, with the presumption that he was going to win the election, in order to bring in the way to the United States in some sort of diplomatic arrangement. It has actually, in my opinion, played something of a positive influence, but we'll see how that actually works out when rubber meets the road. But point being is, will the American pressure on the other side on Brussels be able to offset that in order to restore some sort of, I guess you could say, equilibrium to Europe, for lack of a better word? Because
Hmm.
otherwise, especially, and as you had mentioned, the primary and even the secondary powers of Europe, whether that be the big powers, that's say France, Germany, Italy to an extent, or the smaller players, the Scandinavian states, the Danish, which I suppose they are Scandinavian, but into parts of Western Europe, they have alternatives of getting gas, whether it's paying a premium on American gas plus the tariffs, whether it's some of the pipelines through the Mediterranean, whether it is some of the more complex arrangements with Turkey. There is ways, but once again, when we're talking about this central into eastern landlocked Europe, uh, it's going to be very difficult. Now, once again, those Turkish pipeline routes could reach up through there, but that's already an issue in and of itself with the way NATO-Turkish relations are at this point, despite Turkey being a part of NATO. But point being, it is that countries like Slovakia, Hungary, even to an extent, say Poland, even though Poland will continually shoot itself in the foot if it means getting one over the Russians, as we've learned time and time again. But once again, when it comes to this, I guess the the Danube, the Danubian Europe, if you will, the Europe along the
Hmm.
Danube, they're the ones who stand to lose the most in this. And I would
Yeah.
say, out of all of the European, at least public figures, they have produced the most sanity. I know, out of Austria, although they've never really managed to form a strong Eurosceptic government, in terms of populists on both the left and the right, they have been very good about questioning these things. And we saw the election results out of Austria, where you did get that strange convergence of left and right populism voting against the incumbent. And like I said, throughout this part of Central into Eastern Europe, there's been largely a voice of reason from these landlocked countries that have literally no other choice for their energy, for their economy, than to stay on at least stable terms with the Russians. Whereas, of course, the Atlanticists, they're not going to worry about that. There's the other Eastern European states, as we mentioned, that are willing to quite literally light themselves on fire if it does mean the Russians losing just a little bit. See the
Yes,
Poles and the
yes.
Balts. But point being is, when it comes to that heartland of Europe, they do stand to lose. And the question is, uh, will an incoming Trump administration, through its pressure on Brussels and through any sort of diplomatic efforts of its own, be able to restore that balance in Europe? Because honestly, I do think that with that, even though there are alternative routes, as we discussed, for these other European powers, we've seen it happen already. It will cascade throughout the continent. It will spread, and it will be the collective burden of the continent in order to deal with this economic crisis. Not only these countries, but like I said, these countries have all become so interdependent on each other because of European integration that what happens to one is going to eventually affect them all, either positively or adversely. And the question is whether Trump, intentionally or unintentionally, depending on his policy, is he going to be able to give some sort of breathing room to Europe, or are they just going to continue on the same spiral of destruction?
I mean, all pertinent questions, and we're really gonna. I think we're gonna find out in the first 3 months of 2025 for
Yeah, I
sure.
agree.
I do want to reuse some statements that Fico made
Please do.
today. This is both hilarious and shocking. I will not quote them, but Zelensky made me certain proposals behind closed doors, and I want to say that Slovakia is not in a state of war, neither with the Russian Federation nor with Ukraine. We are very sorry about what is happening in Ukraine now, and we are not going to give them weapons. We know that the Ukrainians are losing this war completely. Ladies and gentlemen, I must say that President Zelensky categorically rejects any ceasefire, any truce. He still has some idea that first and perhaps he should get everything in the world, and only then will he talk about some kind of truce. And when I asked him about the transit of gas through Ukraine, Zelensky ruled out any idea of it. He made proposals that seem absurd to me. For example, that he would agree to it only if we did not pay Russia until the end of the war. What fool would give us free gas? As we were coming to the end, the president returned to the topic of gas and asked me whether I would vote for NATO membership if he gave me 500 million euros from Russian assets. Of course, I know. Of course, I immediately answered that I would never. You just know my opinion about Ukraine's membership in NATO, and it is strange that he asked me such a question because he knows perfectly well that inviting Ukraine to NATO is completely unrealistic. Interesting, huh?
Oh, very. And it's very par for the course for Fico. Once again, one of those voices of reason in Europe, and I think he will continue to be until something does happen to him. And like we had mentioned before in previous episodes, and even in this episode, there's a reason why the courts screwed over Georgescu. They do
Hmm.
not want too many of these people in Europe. And like I said, it is in that heartland of Europe, in that Danube River course, those countries that the Danube goes through, eventually flowing into the Black Sea, where you are getting a lot more of these level-headed takes, a lot more of these level-headed public figures, particularly on the issue of Russia and Ukraine. And that I think the few they do have already, such as Orban, such as Fico, and like I said, even some of the latent populist energy somewhere like, say, Austria, they cannot afford any more of that. And Bulgaria, not exactly part of that system, but once again, you do occasionally get some uh, reasonable moments out of the Bulgarians, whether from its government or from its opposition. And even though these are small players within Europe, even though they're arguably irrelevant in some cases, the presence there and the political structure of the European Union does give them an outsized voice, which does make them dangerous in a sense, especially if, by some stretch of the imagination, that is able to cascade over into some of the bigger players in Europe. And I think at this point, strangely enough, I would have never thought I would say this. Germany might actually be one of those countries, and we'll talk about that when we get into the bizarre case of the attacks in Germany that happened as of day of recording, because this will be up next day, and even in France, where their parliament is currently in a state of uh, disarray, I guess
Suspension.
you could say, um,
Yeah.
disaster. But there's a lot that can be said. But the some good news is that both Europe and the United States did relent and eased up on the Gazprom sanctions, particularly in relation to Hungary. So that valve of pressure, or that lever of pressure, I should say, has been taken off of them. So there will be at least some reprieve with some of the latent Hungarian economic issues. But unless you have anything further to say on this entire situation, I guess we could move into Germany.
We could. I have one thing to add that I forgot to mention, that Putin made, some of the rhetoric he used in the speech that he made during that, end of year conference that he always does. And this story comes from a rabbi a Swiss rabbi. What's his name? Pinchas Goldschmidt. Pinchas Goldschmidt demands the world condemn Vladimir Putin because of his anti-Semitic remarks. And this is the way it begins. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday used anti-Semitic rhetoric during his lengthy end-of-year conference, accusing people, including ethnic Jews, of tearing apart the Russian Orthodox Church. During the press conference, Putin was asked about punitive measures some European countries have taken against the Russian Orthodox Church in the wake of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine over the church's close relationship with Putin's government. The Council of Europe recently labeled the church a propaganda tool of the Kremlin and several European countries have expelled church officials due to security concerns. So he goes on to say comments made during the press conference where he said Jews are tearing apart the Russian Orthodox Church, major echo Soviet era anti-Semitism under Stalin when the Kremlin persecuted Jews and accused them of being rootless cosmopolitans. This is hilarious. I didn't catch this. Of course, it's 4.5 hours. I'm watching like clips that are anywhere from like 30 seconds to 8 minutes, and I've watched over a dozen of them. I'm trying to remember which one he said this in, but this is uh, it is quoted. Uh, he didn't single them out completely. That's why he said, including ethnic Jews, of tearing apart the Russian Orthodox Church. So, think about that when you think about Syria, when you think about him also saying the main benefactor of what happened to Syria is Israel.
I was under the impression that Putin was just an unapologetic philo-Semite who gives Israel
Oh
everything
yeah,
it
he's a
wants.
rabbi. He's a secret
He
rabbi.
is. He is.
I know people on YouTube in the YouTube comment section told me 8 years ago.
Did you see him with Chabad Lubavitch back in 2001?
Oh yeah, who can
Yeah.
forget?
Do you think Putin has met Fivish?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. So I'm sure he's married one of his daughters off to one of the five-ish people.
Oh, naturally. Naturally.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh, Five-ish gets far too much attention on this show. I apologize for that, but I had to bring it up because
yeah.
we brought Pavad Lubitsch. Well, I brought Pavad Lubitsch. Remember the tunnels from earlier this year?
Oh yeah. Oh
That
man, we're gonna have such a crazy end of your show.
Yeah, that's I don't even know where to begin, but I suppose not getting distracted. We will get. Speaking of bizarre schizo takes, let's talk about this guy from Germany.
Yeah. Oh
And
my God.
it was in uh, Modgen uh, Magdeburg.
Yeah, Modgen. Then
It,
what?
pardon our German. We're much better with the Slavic languages. But with that aside, there was a story that felt
Magdeburg.
like it was right out of 2015, 2016, of a man driving a truck into a Christmas market that uh, the numbers I'm working with so far, they probably will be updated by the time this premieres, are two fatalities and 70 injuries.
Yeah, and
And
one of the fatalities was a toddler. What a piece of shit. Absolute piece of
yeah,
shit.
I mean, of really, what more can you say? But the man apprehended for this was a Saudi national named Taleb Al Abdul Mohsen. Now, I know what many of you who probably are not familiar with the story are thinking. Clearly, this is a man who is a Salafist Muslim. He is taken in by the rhetoric of these bizarre clerics that Saudi Arabia and Pakistan fund. No, actually, quite the opposite. He is an apostate from Islam, as they would call him. He is an ex Muslim who sought asylum in Germany because he is a political dissident in Saudi Arabia because of his religious views. And many of his remarks, they found his Twitter account, so we'll see how long that lasts before it gets taken
Yeah, yeah.
down.
I'm sending it to you now.
Um, yeah, but very pro-Israel, very
Extremely pro-Israel.
anti-Islam. So let's just get some of these bizarre remarks up. Of course, pro-Syrian quote-unquote
One of
revolution.
his remarks are incredibly five-ish. The whole copyright thing.
Yeah, let's get to that. Okay, so yeah, so here, let me get that one up. I'll get it on screen for our audience because, like I said, this and these go back like years. And probably the most bizarre part of this is I'll need to see if I can find the statements, but he apparently was a quote unquote AFD supporter. But yeah, you can read this one for yourself. I'm not going to say it too much out loud because I know YouTube's going to be sensitive. But there you can read for yourself. This is the remarks the man made himself on Christmas Day 2019, mind you. So I don't know what you want to make of that. I know what I make of it certainly. And he's he said he hated Germany because it was quote unquote Islamizing Europe was his exact words. And like I said, so he aped what the Muslim radicals in Europe do. Yeah, you can see right here Saudi military opposition. Germany chases female Saudi asylum seekers inside Nazi Germany, destroy their lives. Germany wants to Islamize Europe, no sign. You can see that. You see the website he's got linked. Joined in 2016 when all of the best Twitter activity took place, as I'm sure we know. I wonder what this guy's opinions on Trump are. I wonder if his account's still up, if we can still pull that right there. Um, okay, here's another one of him.
There's retweets I sent you. Like he's retweeting. Like I mean, he follows these people. I think.
Yeah, here I'll get these. I'll get these up on screen. A Twitter deep dive on this schizophrenic right here. But of course, he's also very anti-Iran. Pretty much, he maintains all of the Sunni Salafist biases and prejudices without the Islam
Yes,
itself.
that's right.
Which in many ways shows how religion and ethnicity can indeed be conflated, and I do think that is very much a case of this, where despite him being a quote unquote dissident from Saudi Arabia, like I said, a lot of these things die hard. Not particularly anti-Israel, much like the Saudis themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just put up some of these, some of his Twitter activity to the extent that I can. And like I said, it's like terrible case, but it's so absurd. This guy that
It's
all you
insane.
can do is all you can muster is laughter at how does a man like this exist? This man is a Twitter personality who did this. Like he is a Twitter schizo, and I know that probably
Yeah.
applies to our audience. I say that affectionately in many cases, but not in this case here. But look,
Yeah.
I was first with Israel to support the Syrian Revolution. He has the Israeli flag next to the color revolution GAYOP flag of Syria. But here, I'll pull up one of the other ones where he's actually whining in Ilhan Omar's Twitter replies about
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
about the situation in Iran. This probably was about 2018, I would imagine. Like I said, this guy.
Why would he do it? I mean, because when this whole thing happened, the first thought I had was, so Israel's been bombing Syria, okay, and Jelani has pleaded, even with the UN, Israel, please stop bombing us. Like, we did this big favor for you. Like, now you have to listen to us. My dude, you're the one who did the favor. Are you an idiot? You're not in control.
Yeah,
Hello?
get complete moron. But
Complete
it's
moron. Like, and again, it reminds me so much of like the war in Ukraine, the two sides. We just have to defeat Russia, and then we're gonna get real based. It's like,
we'll get real
uh,
principled Arab democracy if we just
your ass broke. You can't do anything.
yeah, it's like it is so bizarre because like I said, he carries all the prejudices of what you'd expect from the worst radicals out of Saudi Arabia, minus the actual belief in Islam itself. And
Yeah.
on top of all that, he was a doctor. He was one of the
Yes.
skilled immigrants they brought in.
Yep.
And I mean, I think it should be, and I know a lot of people who still cling to the idea won't be convinced by this, but not to politicize a tragedy too much, it shows the folly of civic nationalism like nothing else I've ever seen before. That this
Mhm.
man came in, he had all the right liberal, quote unquote, Western values, and he still did this. In fact, he did this because of those values. He, once
Yeah.
again, aped the people he so despises because he despises them. And once again, his target, coincidentally enough, the same people as that. And I'd say I agree with you. When I first heard this, I thought it was going to be some sort of fallout from
Yeah.
Syria, where this guy was some
He
revolution
represent.
shill. He was
Yep.
a revolution shill, but I
Yep.
figured he'd be on the more Islamic side, one of the Jelani supporters, and then
Yep.
he was lashing out because Israel didn't uphold its end of the bargain to nobody's shock, I should say. But that was the exact opposite case where I mean look I will pull this one up again of his retweet. of these flags side by side. This
Yeah.
is the level of delirium and delusion this man lives in.
Yeah,
And
well, the thing is he, in a way, in his own schizo mind, he like all these sides coexist perfectly. Um, Judaism, Western secularism, um, tacitly, Sunniism, but anti-Shia because he had several tweets that were very anti-Shia, right?
cultural Sunni.
Cultural Sunni, yeah, he's a cultural Sunni, right? Like all of them perfectly coexist, and you have like stupid Westoids that are like celebrating the fall of Assad, like completely negating the fact that like you remember that group Al Qaeda that like I mean you and I of course don't even believe in the official story, but for these things to work, you actually need some believers. And so in any case, remember the group that killed 3,000 of your own people, and like one of the most horrible things. I literally cried when I saw it. I am not kidding you. I was at work. I went downstairs and I saw it on the TV, and I was. That's how affected I was. And so the U.S. government in and the kind of the determination that it's always exhibited, decided to get Al Qaeda to run Syria because Al Qaeda bad, but Assad worse. Of course, again because Israel and a
Yeah,
few
we,
other
we all know. We
factors.
all know what the score here, and that you spend 10 years
Like
hunting down.
that's how pathetic and irredeemable they are.
Yeah, it's beyond words. It is beyond words. And these ideological contradictions exist, as you said, seemingly because it all serves the interests of the American State Department and ultimately Israel. And that's all these people care about. And forgive me for making too much light of this, I think we have our first Redditor terrorist on record. Um, I don't know, maybe this guy's an intellectual dark web type. I don't know, maybe he was really into that kind of stuff. Who knows? But like I said, the most bizarre one of these cases I've seen because these are usually very predictable. You go back to the ones in the mid 2010s. It's these guys who are quote unquote refugees from Iraq, Syria, Libya who cheered on the same regime changes that they, of course, ended up fleeing from. Then got radicalized in the West by these Saudi funded madrasas, these Saudi funded mosques, and committed these acts of terror. But like I said, this guy was the exact opposite. And I don't know, maybe he's some accelerationist hoping that despite his views, no matter what he did, this will somehow result in the expulsion of quote unquote Muslims from Europe. Uh,
He was literally
but
featured on German television.
oh yeah, that's right. You've sent me that.
Yeah, it's like a model citizen.
Yeah, yeah.
Get
The
up, and he's an atheist. He's actually wearing a fedora.
Yeah, here I'll grab
If you,
some screenshots from this. I'll see what I can do for you guys. Yeah, but
the
yeah,
entire West has become a fucking clown show.
here let me find a good screenshot from this. But yeah, he pretty much created a website that is supposed to funnel out Saudi dissidents or dissidents from the Middle East
Yeah,
who aren't Muslim. Of course, that only applies to his Reddit atheist cohorts. But okay, I found the perfect shot that probably encapsulates what this guy. Yeah, right here on a BBC fluff piece. Let me just get this up right here. Uh,
oh, it was BBC. Sorry, my
yeah, but I
mistake.
mean, once again, distinction without a difference with a lot of these things where they
True.
rebroadcast each other's work. It's all subtitled. BBC probably pulled it from a German television station, is what the case was, because the interview is in German. So
Oh, it could have been DW. I don't know.
yeah, that whatever slop they put out, it's that they're not as bad as the BBC, but still, you get my point. But yeah,
They
here's him
literally are
right
not
here
as bad. But
with the fedora, bragging about his website, and it's somehow he manages to be more disgusting than the previous ones because while you can't condone it, while I do think those people deserve the worst penalties that are available, uh, they are radical Muslims doing jihad in their
Yeah,
own
the
belief. It's
Takfiri types.
yeah, it is like these Salafist types who have been completely committed to this idea. Whereas what this guy did makes absolutely no sense. It's completely bizarre. And I think that makes it worse because, like I said, the
It
other ones
does.
are so steeped in their own delusion. And I suppose he is, but they're so steeped in their own delusion and a more established system that, yeah, you come to expect that, and you realize these people should have never been here in the first place. But once again, this is supposed to be the model immigrant. This is supposed to be the model civic nationalist case of the man who saw the light and left behind the retrograde medieval system of Saudi Islam, but then once again, you can remove all of that, but he still behaves exactly like the worst of his co-ethnics, the worst of his former co-religionists, in
Yep.
the name of a new god.
Yeah, yeah. Because they're aligned, right? The whole point of the Madras is to get them to do
Oh yeah,
like
they are.
American Israel's bidding. They're idiots.
He might feud with these people all day. He might think that they're retrograde backwards. He might be so thankfully escaped from Saudi Arabia. But at the end of the day, when the chips are down, these guys are on the exact same side. Same with the hyper Zionists who complain about Al Qaeda and ISIS. Once again, they're doing your bidding. You guys are on the
Why didn't he
exact
ram
same
it
side.
into like a Muslim prayer,
Yeah,
right? Because why a Christmas market where people are with their children? Why do that?
like I said, the only logic, and I don't even want to attribute this to it, that I can think is it was it some sort of accelerationist where thing where he was trying to portray himself as a Muslim in order to increase anti-Islamic sentiments?
I don't know.
Like I said, that's literally the only thing I can think of that makes sense, and I'm sure more details will come out
Oh
as
yeah.
time goes on, and there'll probably be fresh details by the time this actually comes out. But I mean, disgusting man. I hope that they deport him back to Saudi Arabia and that he faces justice in their courts, frankly. And I don't say that as somebody with great love for the Saudis, but once again, uh, no, I don't think he deserves the 15-month sentence that the German government would give him. And it is bizarre because there was something going around from one of these NGOs, this comic about this political prisoner from Kuwait who escaped to the UK because Turkey and continental Europe weren't good enough for him to seek refuge in, so he had to go all the way to the UK, so therefore he's a model citizen. And then a day after that starts making the round this NGO propaganda little comic strip, you get something like this that happens.
Completely. This was not, as they say on my bingo card for 2024.
No, no, it was not.
Unforeseeable, completely unforeseeable.
Yeah,
But like
all the
again,
networks get reactivated as soon as Assad falls. There's nothing to question here.
yeah, it's small price to pay.
Yeah, I suppose those funds had to go somewhere else, and yeah, this is and I think this will continue to happen. That you will get this sort of ideological radicalization, even from non-Muslims from that part of the world, and maybe not even from that part of the world, but just in general, where political violence, act of terror, unfortunately, I think are going to increase, especially in parts of northwestern Europe. Think Germany, France, and the UK in particular. Maybe some more isolated cases, say Italy, Spain, and on the fringes of Europe that still do have these populations, still do have these same issues, but not to the extent that say a lot of these countries do. But
let's
unfortunately, I think it's going to
let's
continue.
say sorry, you finish. You finish. I've been very
But
rude
no,
this
no, it's
episode.
very un-Canadian of you. but but no, that's really all I was going to say. But I do think it's unfortunately going to get worse, and it's going to play out this way, and that you're going to see more, like I said, of these kind of attacks from both the hardline Muslims and from, frankly, the liberal ideologues, and that they are going to be the ones who resort to this kind of terror and violence as well.
Uh, Yeah, I mean, we don't know what I mean. It, the West is in a very radicalized state, and and there's a lot of useful idiots. But what I wanted to say was, let's say that Syria, um, the sanctions. I mean, can Israel tolerate, um, a Salafist state? Can it tolerate a Salafist state that becomes more prosperous than it's ever been before, which isn't shooting that high, right? Remember, Israel wants this place in chaos like Libya forever, right? And I think a lot of the Sunnis don't understand, like maybe Saudi Arabia, that they're next. You're thinking about Iran, but it might be you. And so let's say Syria is in disarray, no sanctions relief or very little. The oil is still being stolen. Like, what happens then? I mean, if you were America and you were Israel, you'd want that. You want like another civil war to occur in Syria,
Like you said,
right?
Libya is the
I,
model.
I, I mean, shootouts have already happened between some of the groups, right? It's only been 12 days since the fall, and or 14, something like that, and so it's still very early.
Less than 2 weeks.
Yes, and so okay, um, if Syria doesn't change, I mean, Erdogan wants 3.5 million Syrians to go back. If things don't change, they're not going back. Where are they going to go? Of course, America has a lot of leverage on all these countries. They can ruin their economies, and Turkey is very vulnerable to this. And I mean, where are these refugees going to go if Syria is no different than it was under Assad, right? So, um, can we expect some terrorist attacks in Europe to add pressure? Like, we're not going to attack Israel, but if we attack you, maybe we can get have some of these goals met, like the relief of sanctions,
Or
so that
alternatively,
reconstruction can begin.
I think one thing a lot of these people can be talked into is terrorist attacks in Russia.
Oh yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. We'll do all of that. You just have to defeat Russia first.
Yeah, of course. That's what it always comes back to.
Yeah.
But with that being said, with the question of Turkey, I know that there was some floating of the idea of permanent occupation or annexation of some of the northern provinces of Syria that were historically occupied predominantly by Turks back in the Ottoman era. And I
Yeah.
don't know whether that would actually come to fruition, but if they're talking about resettlement, if they're talking about uh, stabilizing the situation for these 3 million, 3.5 million migrants, then that may very well be the action that they try to take. And you're right, the Israelis want Syria destabilized. They want Syria as a Libya, whereas Turkey needs Syria just as a subservient client state that will do its bidding, which the two are just they're mutually exclusive. And I do think another question about the Israelis is how long are they able to maintain the ever increasing buffer zone that they push into Syria? How long are they going to be able to occupy these parts of Daraa or the other southern provinces near the Jordanian border? Uh, are they going to maintain the loyalty of the Druze population that they are quote unquote protecting there? Uh, there's a lot of those kind of questions up in the air, and I think especially with the ceasefire with Hezbollah being as shaky as ever, some of the strikes by the Yemenis that you did have Houthi strikes into Tel Aviv just within the past few days, as well as a number of other factors, and the fact that the Iranians are still more than capable of regrouping themselves and reestablishing some sort of foothold within the Shia Crescent. Once again, a lot of that remains to be seen. That Israel still does risk overexpansion, and that it could very much sabotage itself that way.
Right. Right. Now that Assad is out of the way, in many ways, what were the ultimate goals are going to be laid bare. Um, if we have time, I just wanted to bring up some.
Yeah, we're not even at the 2 hour mark. Go ahead.
Yeah. So since we're talking about Syria, I want to go to. I saw another video by NFC Peace. Okay. I bring it up because I believe on one of the Telegram channels there was floated an idea. I'll find it, but let me get through this first. Um, an idea that that some of the generals were paid off, right? Uh, Putin in his speech yesterday mentioned that the initial incursion into Aleppo by HTS only included roughly 350 men, so like a battalion. But there were 3,000 fighters there, and like I said, the drones. Once you occupy the heights and you outnumber, it's going to be very deadly for the other force. And we've gone over how little pay the Syrian soldiers received, and how they had to lie about being in the like that they were at their posts. I don't mean in this incursion by HTS, but I mean throughout the years, particularly from 2018 onwards. Um, and there was just no money in it. Literally, America suffocated this country. So, going back to the Christian general of the Fourth Division. So this Fourth Division was run by Bashar al-Assad's brother Maher or Mahar, and he was given the order, apparently by Assad, to stand down. Okay, and Maher was not at his post when his division received this order. His second in command was told this. When he said that he has to stand down, the second in command refused. He says, "I have to speak to Mahar." And you know what they did? They
Yes.
killed him on the spot. Oh yeah, that's right. I sent it to you. They shot him dead on the spot. Uh, Maher comes back. This division had like roughly 18,000 men, and he says, "No, we can't do that order." Of course, the order was already, it was a fait accompli at that point. And so the men ran, and Maher had 50 men, and they fought their way out of Damascus. And not all the 50 men made it, and Maher was wounded.
And to my understanding, a large amount of the Fourth Division actually did end up making it to Iraq and linked up with the PMF forces in Iraq.
Right, right. And the
The
Russians
Popular
also,
Mobilization Front, for those of you not in the know.
right, right. And also the Russians airlifted 4,000 like pro-Iranian troops out of the region.
And
Uh,
depending on the Iranian strategy going forward, I would be very shocked if they are not in active contact with Mahar in the Fourth Division, because I think if they are going to try to make any sort of spearhead back into Syria, they're going to need the expertise of somebody like that and his men. And like I said, that question is very much up in the air because the Iranians are in a very precarious situation themselves when it comes to their involvement in Syria. But if the so-called axis of resistance is going to survive outside of Iran and the Houthis, they need to reestablish their at least some sort of control over the Shia Crescent, which would require a reincursion, at least by proxy forces, in back into Syria. And I know this is all very recent. Once again, it feels like it's been a lifetime, but it has been less than 2 weeks since Assad's actually turns out. And I'll get into the statement put out by Assad, but Assad's apparent forced departure from Syria by the Russians. Uh, but that's like I said, that's an interesting letter that he had put out. But I don't think the Iranians are down for the count in Syria, and I would be surprised, even with Pezeshkian in power, if they completely abandon the project, especially considering how high the stakes are.
right, right. So I'm trying to find the article. Okay, long story short, there was a suspect a general, a Sunni general within the Assad um, retinue, if you will. Okay, and he please forgive me, everyone. I'm trying. So essentially, what he does is this guy begins to restructure. He decentralizes the army. We've already spoken about this um, um, aspect. Assad is not listening to the Russians, saying that they need to be retrained, refitted, so on and so on. And essentially, this guy, it's suspected that this guy is the one that might have caused other generals to join his side or compromise them. And I think that fits with what we're seeing about these orders. Maher's second in command, who's killed, right? I even wonder, like, was it Assad that gave this order? Maybe he did. Anyways, I'm very please. I'm sorry that I can't
No,
uh,
it's
I can't find the article because there was a name that was attached. Um, maybe in the maybe in the next on the next show.
But I did
I,
actually have Assad's full statement pulled up that he issued on the 16th, which would have been
yes,
Monday.
yeah. Go
So
ahead.
I'll just briefly read over this. This is from Moscow, which he was repatriated to Moscow with his family as a result of that, and this will explain some of the details of that. As terrorism spread across Syria and ultimately reached Damascus on the evening of Saturday, 7th December 2024, questions arose about the president's fate and whereabouts. This occurred amidst a flood of misinformation and narratives far removed from the truth, aimed at recasting international terrorism as a liberation revolution for Syria. At such a critical juncture in the nation's histories where truth must take precedence, it is essential to address these distortions. Unfortunately, the prevailing circumstance at the time, including a total communication blackout for security reasons, delayed the release of the statement. This does not replace a detailed account of the events that unfolded, which will be provided when the opportunity allows. First, my departure from Syria, this is Assad's statement, just once again for clarification, was neither planned nor did it occur in the final hours of the battles, as some have claimed. On the contrary, I remained in Damascus carrying out my duties until the early hours of Sunday, 8th of December 2024. As terrorist forces infiltrated Damascus, I moved to Latakia in coordination with our Russian allies to oversee combat operations. Among arrival at Upon arrival at the Himenim air base this morning, it became that's also the one in Latakia, which is close to the Tartus port. But it became clear that our forces completely withdrawn from all battle lines and the last army positions had fallen. As the field situation in the area continued to deteriorate, the Russian military base itself came under intensified attack by drone strikes. With no viable means of leaving the base, Moscow requested the base command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia on the evening of Sunday, December 8th. This took place a day after the fall of Damascus, following the collapse of the final military positions and the resulting paralysis of all remaining state institutions. At no point during these events did I consider stepping down or seeking refuge, nor was such a proposal made by any individual or party. The only course of action was to continue fighting against the terrorist onslaught. I reaffirm that the person who, from the very first day of the war, refused to barter for the salvation of his nation for personal gain or to compromise his people in exchange for numerous offers and enticements, is the same person who stood alongside the officers and soldiers of the army on the front lines, just meters from the terrorists in the most dangerous and intense battlefields. He is the same person who, in the darkest years of war, did not leave but remained with his family alongside his people, confronting terrorism under bombardment and the recurring threats of terrorist incursions into the capital over 14 years of war. Furthermore, the person who has never abandoned the resistance in Palestine nor Lebanon, nor betrayed his allies who stood by him, cannot possibly be the same person who would forsake his own people or betray the army and the nation to which he belongs. I have never sought positions for personal gain, but I have always considered myself a custodian of the national project. Supported by the faith of Syrian people who believe in this vision, I have carried out an unwavering conviction in their will and ability to protect the state, defend its institution, uphold their choices, to the very last moment. When the state falls in the hand of terrorism and the ability to make a meaningful contribution is lost, any position becomes void of purpose, rendering its occupation meaningless. It does not in any way diminish my profound sense of belonging to Syria and her people. A bond that remains unshaken by position or circumstance is belonging filled with hope that Syria will once again be free and independent. End of statement. Now, when I had first heard the news out of Damascus, what I was honestly hoping for, just for the sake of Assad's legacy, I thought it would have been best had they found him in Damascus and had he met his fate. Now, I hope that his family had gotten out at that point, but that didn't happen. It did come out that he went to Russia. Now, at that point, I didn't think that fleeing the country was in his character, so it struck me as bizarre. And the conclusion I had come to personally was that there was a an arrangement of power agreement that was hoisted upon him, and he was really given no choice, and he was effectively exiled from the country rather than leaving of his own volition, which is closer to reality than him just packing his bags and leaving the
Yes.
country altogether. Because once again, it doesn't make sense why he would have stood for almost 2 decades, for, once again, 14 years of the Syrian civil war, only to pack up bags and leave at the last minute. The whole thing just seemed off. It did seem like he was quite literally forced from power from somebody within his inner circle, and that
Yes.
somebody in his inner circle stabbed him in the back. Which, if we're to take him at face value, which once again he's a politician, so he's not going to be. You have to take his word with a grain of salt, as you would anyone else's. It does seem that there was a betrayal within the system, and that he was quickly swept away, and that being in Latakia, which when I first heard that the plane was going to Latakia, there was rumors of that. I was wondering whether that's where Syrian forces were going to regroup and they were going to effectively
Hmm.
govern the country out of there, and that the front would be stabilized through that. But no, that didn't happen, and that there was a quick retreat. Which once again does make me think that Assad was sold out. That one of his generals, one of his inner circle, stabbed him in the back, and that does appear to be the case, or perhaps
Yeah.
multiple of them.
Yes. The coup already happened, and part of it was mismanagement. Part of it was him. Um, for instance, thinking, he could, because he desperately wanted to be re-included into the Arab world. That's him overestimating how much power they have, or um, or just how incompetent they are. I don't know. Like, uh, yeah. So I don't know what to say. He made decisions that I think that baffled me. Considering considering the war, and the cost of the war, the amount of lives. Uh, I don't. Uh, I don't really have anything more to add. Yeah,
Yeah, I would say that it.
to me that's what it's looking like. It's like there was some kind of a coup here.
Yes, and it does make the question. Once again, we're talking about. I use throne metaphorically because yes, Syria is technically a republic, but we're talking about a man who inherited power from his father. That's as close to a monarchy as you can get, and we're talking about the second in the line of succession, given the circumstances of his brother's death in the 1990s. He was a London-educated doctor, and he was quickly recalled back to Syria in order to assume office. And you do have to wonder how much of Western influence education had on him, how much of the reins of power he actually controlled in the first place, how much he deferred to his inner circle. Because you do have to recall, going back through the history of his time in power, in the early 2000s, there was a cleaning of house in order to make overtures to the West, to Turkey, and to the Arab world, where he cleaned out a lot of his father's old guard and put in a lot more quote unquote moderate people. That's around the same time he withdrew Syrian forces from Lebanon as well. And as we saw, despite his overtures, that still led to revolution on his doorstep, that still led to Western backed rebellions, Turkish backed rebellions, Israeli backed rebellions across Syria. And to my understanding, there was a similar purge around 2020 as well, when the war really started to calm down. because of number one, suspicion of seven elements. Number two, once again trying to make overtures to the Arab world and Turkey. And as we saw, that also completely backfired. And that's also on top of years of economic strain with American proxies via the Kurds, the so called SDF, occupying the wheat fields and the oil fields of Syria, where they were strangling them out of both food and energy. So at a certain point, all those factors were going to coalesce, and there would be generals, there would be people within the Syrian government who would more than gladly stab Assad in the back. And while a lot of people do like to paint Assad's government as an Alawite cabal where it was just him and his tribe's inner circle, it was very much a coalition government. He understood, especially with the cleaning of the house, that he couldn't rule Syria just by appointing 10% of the population in positions of power. And that there were a lot
Yes.
of Sunnis who surrounded him. There were a lot of tribal people who surrounded him. And if you want to go back to the History Legends video of the fall of Syria, even though he actually put that up before Assad properly fell from power, he had agreement. The Assad government had agreements with several Bedouin tribes. Many of the leaders who ended up turncoating on him when it was very convenient. So there was a game of tribal and ethnic politics also at play, where because of the prevailing circumstances, he also lost their support, and it seemed just like a domino effect where it eventually led to him being forced in power.
Hmm.
There was a coup. He was evacuated to Latakia, where I do believe the intention was to regroup Syrian forces still loyal to the Assad government and make a last stand, but it was too late by that point.
Yeah, actually, I found the article. I sent you an infographic if you want to post
Okay,
that.
I'll get that up.
Okay, and I'll read you. It's very interesting, especially in light of what I just said on the NFC Peace channel. So, was the collapse of Syria the result of the betrayal of local generals? The rapid fall of Bashar al-Assad's government has sparked discussions that it did not happen without bribery of local generals. One of the figures in the rumors is Hussam Luka, the head of the Syrian General Intelligence Directorate. It is still difficult to unequivocally assert how reliable the suspicions are, but they look curious against the backdrop of several facts. One, Luka's predecessor was Mohammed Dib Zaitoun, a supporter of Russia's presence. After his departure, all pro-Russian personnel were purged from the central apparatus and sent to regional departments. Since 2020, Luka uh, advocated for reducing cooperation with Russia and increasing it with Iran. He secured the support of Ali Mamluk, an Assad ally, who began to receive a percentage of each Iranian loan for promoting the interests of the Islamic Republic. As the country's economic situation deteriorated, Luka made contact with the intelligence services of Turkey and Qatar under the guise of work. Now, it should be mentioned, uh, the Syrian and the Turkish intelligence met on the border in a town on the border of Syria and Turkey regularly. Okay, just so people know. What's the result? There is a high-ranking Sunni Syrian general, not from the ruling clan, who alternately betrays Syria's main allies and his connections with the intelligence of Turkey and Qatar. According to some reports, it was Hassam Luka who made the order to cease resistance in Homs and Damascus. He is also associated with reports of an attempted coup and plans to arrest Assad during the failed address to the nation on December 7th. I don't know how many people know this. Assad did write, apparently, a speech. He was supposed to speak on December the 7th, and then the TVs stopped essentially. Hassam Luka's whereabouts are currently unknown, but if he suddenly resurfaces as part of the new Syrian authorities, it will confirm his role in the seizure of the country by militants. So, very interesting.
I mean, it all adds up. This,
Yeah.
and as anyone who knows, who has been listening to just anyone in these circles for long enough, we all know power top down, grassroots revolutions aren't really a thing. And that just as much applies to these sort of situations where if somebody like Assad were going to fall, it would be because the players in Syria started to move away from him. And I think that's exactly what's happened. That's exactly what we're looking at right now.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to mention one other thing about Syria that is a bit more, I guess you could say, comical for lack of a better word, and that is Al Jilani, former Al Qaeda darling, has been removed from the State Department wanted list, and that his bounty for $10 million is no longer valid. And somebody was interrogating, what is it, Matt Miller, the State Department spokesman, about the bounty being valid, saying, "Oh yeah, it's still valid. Just you just can't be a State Department employee." And just days later, the bounty is removed, and Al Jilani is removed from the list. I guess his DEI jihadism really took off, and that, I mean, like I said, it's been less than 2 weeks, but I do think it's bizarre, even in such a case where destabilization was the goal, that we don't have some sort of provisional government in Damascus right now. That really nobody knows who is in charge. Now, even though that government would hold no real power, much like the official government in Libya, much like the official government in Iraq, there is still no direct figurehead. There's still nobody who is occupying the office of president, even just in name. Not Al Jilani, not any of these people. And I wonder, how long is that situation going to continue? Are we to accept that the Syrian state is effectively dissolved, and that there's been no news out of Syrian state apparatuses even after this so-called revolution? That even the so-called revolutionaries themselves have just resorted back to the same street fights, whether that's between the Syrian National Army and HTS or any of these other groups or some Ba'ath Party loyalist holdouts that you do get in some parts of the Alawite country. But at this point, once again, nobody has. There hasn't even been a figurehead to this beyond Al Jilani, who doesn't even officially hold a position within the Syrian government. And at this point, it's even beyond Iraq or Syria to the point where Iraq or Libya, excuse me, to the point, do we just accept at this point that the Syrian state has dissolved? Look, I know that's effectively the case, but are they officiating that?
Hmm.
And like I said, it's bizarre because even in these color revolutions, even in these violent overthrow of governments, like I said, there's always a face of it who hold some sort of official office. That you had Poroshenko in power within short order. I can't remember who the interim president was after Yanukovych left, but in Ukraine, much different situation. Or the Iraqis were under direct American occupation until they organized a quote unquote election. Or Libya right now, I can't remember the guy in power, because once again, Haftar effectively runs most of the country, and he's not the quote unquote recognized UN government. But at the end of the day, there's nobody who has taken up that mantle in Syria. And like I said, it's going to be a long time. Is somebody going to make the effort to organize some sort of sham election so they can have some puppet in there who can sell off the country piecemeal to Israel and Turkey? Is the question.
Yeah.
And I think that's inevitable unless they're just going completely mask off and accepting that we effectively destroyed the Syrian state as we know it, and we've dissolved the nation, and that it's just going to be a lawless territory that nobody governs, and it's really just first come, first serve. And I don't know, maybe priorities are bigger. We're to the point where, oh, we can get rid of Assad and leave everybody else to clean up the mess. I mean, there's no Israeli efforts to create some sort of puppet regime. Not that I think they would, unless they're going to set up some sort of quote unquote Druze buffer state. There's no Turkish efforts to install one of their loyalists, at least officially in power. It just seems like everyone is securing their strategic interests and the hell with the rest. To the point, you have the question: does the Syrian state even exist? And I know the answer to that is obviously no, but are they admitting that? Is the real question.
Yeah. I mean, it's de facto over. They get to be the warlords over the ashes. Um, so much for your the again, I mean, America has interests, so does Israel, to keep the Kurds where they are. The Turks don't want them there. That's an issue. But the Turks also make some money, not a lot, but make some money on the oil transfer from the Kurdish north of Syria. That oil goes to Israel, of course. It all depends on, is Israel going to start building, something off the Gaza coast? The speculation. Well, I mean, it's more than speculation that there are oil and gas deposits there. As I said, Israel wants every bordering country to be destroyed and in chaos. It began with Iraq, and has just continued ever since. Um, and to keep that level of chaos for the Americans, I think is going to be difficult. As Mearsheimer says, Israel is America's albatross. Um, but they hold sway. They've bought out the Americans. The Americans now just de facto do whatever Jewish interests demand, and they're very happy to be wealthy. So and they're very good at building narratives, um, and as they say, creating their own reality. So I don't know what's going to happen. For sure, you can see Putin's remarks yesterday that I mean, the implications are that they want to leave. He's already begun transferring ships and other supplies to Libya. Uh, Imagine thinking, like, what, Libya is safer than Syria. But the fact of the matter is, um, I don't think the Israelis want them there.
Well, remember back in
Uh,
2019 when Haftar came within just miles of capturing Tripoli and just
I
ending the
know.
civil war, and that was called off. And you had that very strange convergence of the Russians and the French, that Putin and Macron were actually very united on the issue of Haftar winning, but the
Yes.
Americans pulled the plug on it.
Yep. Yep. And so yeah. So Syria can't change. As long as Israel's in charge, Syria cannot be allowed to change. It cannot be allowed to prosper. It cannot be allowed to rebuild. They need the population to be there, to be poor and malleable as a result of the poverty. And this is going to anger Erdogan, and I think that's why Erdogan wants them there. Erdogan, in this, I mean, yes, he's a backstabber, but this was a profoundly stupid move on his part.
Yes,
You know,
especially
I
considering the
should I
fact that
should
the
mention
that the
that the
Russians,
Americans. Go ahead. Go ahead.
especially considering the fact that the Russians had went 90% of the way to arrange negotiations between Turkey and Syria under Assad. And it's
Yeah.
just that Assad had the non negotiable of Turkish troops on some timetable have to withdraw from Syrian territory. And Erdogan
Yeah.
did not take that. A lot of people like to paint Assad as the stubborn party in that bargain, but I think Erdogan was very much the stubborn party in that bargain, where
Y-
he could have had a way out. He could have had a stable Syrian state that would have been somewhat amenable to his interests, not entirely, but somewhat. And now
Yeah.
he's left with to be king of the ashes, as I suppose you would put it. And as you were saying,
Yeah. I mean, so he wanted to transfer the refugees, but he wanted to transfer them all in the areas where, like, there's Kurds, right? Obviously, he's trying to displace them. Um, and of course, he gave no guarantee that he's going to remove his troops. So, like, what is Assad supposed to sign here, right? Um, so, what is Erdogan going to do? I think in many ways he's now going to have to flip and start working with Russia, because he could have egg in his face, and he doesn't look well. A lot of people have commented on that. Um, he did look very authoritative in his meeting with the Iranian president yesterday or today, and but he's going to go, and the Americans are going to want to install the kind of guy that they wanted back in 2016 when they nearly killed us, Erdogan. And Erdogan, of course, survived the massive earthquake in 2023, and s- you know still won. But if this doesn't work, then then he's going to look like a fool, right? What is he going to do how's he going to force the Syrians to move back if Syria is still in chaos, right?
In fact, in a worse state of chaos.
Yeah. How's that going to happen? Some of
There's
these
no
people have
avenue.
children who weren't even born when who were toddlers, or maybe weren't even born. Like when we had George on the show, you have this Irish woman who was probably, much younger, 11 years ago, certainly wasn't married and had a child. Like this idiot thinks she's going to go back to like a prosperous Syria. I mean, even if there's no war, it's not prosperous enough. There's just no jobs.
No, it's going to be like Afghanistan
Who's
in
going
that
to pay?
sense.
Who's going to pay for
It's
this? Right?
it's
What did America do when it was in Afghanistan? It was better to just keep the place in total chaos and don't build anything. It's kind of like, for Canada, we discussed this like 2 3 years ago. Remember, we did the show on McKinder, and the British strategy was, don't develop Canada, because if you do, it's going to increase trade with the US, and then eventually the US will dominate Canada. So um yeah, but that's really all I have to say for Syria. It's going to be very interesting to watch. The West was going to want to memory hold this thing really bad, and really the only way this thing can creep into the news is if a bunch of jihadists get upset that the sanctions haven't been lifted, that rebuilding hasn't begun, and so on, and more people are leaving. um and it's just, of course, the sectarian violence. We've seen videos this week of like Christian and Alawite homes and churches being destroyed. um, Women in Damascus, whose husbands have been killed, Christian and Alawite, have been sold into slavery,
exactly
right?
like Libya.
Exactly like Libya, right? So we're seeing the same shit. Thank you, America. And I mean, it's just it's disgusting what they've done. This is in no way is this better than Assad, right?
Absolutely not. And I just want to touch on one last couple points. This could be the death knell of Erdogan. I know he survived a lot, but if he can't fulfill that paramount promise of getting these people back into Syria, because he has in fact made the situation worse,
Yeah.
that could be what undoes him. And that's also on top of the increasing pressure. The Americans will double down on support for the Kurds. And then two other things I wanted to mention is that once again we had the question of what are the Iraqis going to do? Are they going to try to make headway back into Syria? And number three, if violence does increase in Syria, which I do think that this is probably the prelude to another civil war, I I don't see any other way around it. Is this is eventually going to spill over into Lebanon, and this is also, I think, much more importantly, going to spill over into Iraq, which means either way, the Iranians are going to be involved. Is it just going to be of their initiative, or is it going to creep towards their border? And because, like I said, I have very little doubts that violence in Syria, which I think is almost inevitable, is going to spill over into both Iraq and Lebanon, and Iraq being the key player there, especially now that it is in a semi-stable yet weakened state. That there is that there is ripe. It is ripe for civil war once again,
Hmm.
in my opinion. Is that going to be what actually ended up happening? But just for the last 10 to 15 minutes of the show, I want to discuss some of the more odd, less serious stories, both being the.
Can
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead if
c-
you have a final
I j-
thought.
I do, and it's in the region, but not necessarily Syria. So the Houthis are at it again. I sent you a little slide
Oh, yes, yes, we did
of
touch
an
on this
attack.
earlier. Let me just pull
Yeah.
this up.
So the Houthis, or the Ansar Allah, I've been told that calling them Houthis is derogatory. I didn't know that. Um, they have been attacking Israel, and they've been hitting them with what appears to be hypersonic missiles, and they're very effective. Now, there were only a few strikes yesterday, but tonight was really something. I saw no less than 3 examples where the hypersonic missiles are evading, like, right there as the Iron Dome missile is going up to intercept them. It's evading them. And we're seeing the kind of strikes that we saw that Iran did on them, and they have hit places. This photo, by the way, is from Tel Aviv, and they have hit Tel Aviv again tonight. Uh, Very, very impressive stuff. This is after they've been bombed by Israel. Um, I don't know. I'm gonna call it right now. The Ansar Allah are the rebels of 2024. Gotta give them props. They ruined trade at the Red Sea. And they're still landing missiles in Israel.
Oh, they are the most competent of the, I guess, overall axis of resistance. That they're the ones who can actually, to the point where they actually came to a consensus with the Yemeni government that they've been fighting for a number of years now to carry out these kind of strikes and to
Yeah.
shut down trade at the Red Sea for any, I guess you could say, pro-Israel country. And it's remarkable that Hezbollah couldn't do it, the Assad government couldn't do it, but it is the Yemenis, the Houthis, Ansar Allah, whatever you want to call them, that are the holdout here. And I wouldn't have thought, and that this is going to be um, the major thorn in Israel's side, the country actually capable of penetrating their air defenses and doing real damage to them. And like I said, that also brings in the question: Israeli overexpansion. How much can they tolerate before they actually have to start making some cuts?
Yeah, yeah.
But I did want to focus just in the last 10 to 15 minutes here on some of
Hmm.
the more odd stories out of North America, less serious, particularly the drone story and Trump's
Mm.
insistence on annexation of Canada. So I'll start with the drones because it's just actually I don't want to name him. I know he listens to the show, but I do have a source in New Jersey who does talk about these drones, and he knows what he's talking about. I trust this guy. You know
Yeah.
who you are if you're listening. But he says, yeah, these things are huge. They're bizarre. That uh, they the FAA, everyone, the authorities keep saying, "Oh, they're just aircraft. Oh, they're just airplanes." Look at these things. He says these things are like the size of SUVs. You see some of these. They're spotted over the skies in New Jersey, New York, parts of eastern Pennsylvania, and it is bizarre. And I don't want to attribute too much to this. I know a lot of people are like trying to get into the UFO thing. The government insists that this is not one of their programs. But you know what the real culprit is?
Mm.
It is the Iranian mothership launching
I
these drones.
I love it. I I want to change my Telegram channel's name to Iranian
I think you
Mothership.
should legally change your name to Iranian mothership.
You know why I should? What's your name? Iranian. What's your last name? Mothership.
It, yeah, that would be nice to have on your legal documentation.
That was so ridiculous.
Yeah,
But
but
I agree with you. Some of them do look different. I'm gonna say something. One of my brothers about 8 years ago, I mean, my brother would go for long walks. He would never call me. Never. And he called me this night and he was completely freaked out. He went in the neighborhood where our cousins used to live. We've walked down this area hundreds of times. And he saw one craft, then another craft, orange, yellow light, and like something within something. And some of these drone sightings have like an object within a kind of a plasma thing around it. Like, yes, I think 90% of them look honestly like aircraft. Like they have the lights, the green and the red, the blinking lights and so on. But some of them look quite strange. And I don't know what they are. So
I
I'm just saying. I'm
yeah,
like, I do think it's funny. Like it's some of the people interviewed, I think, are feds, but that's just my paranoia. But
feds all the way down.
but some of them do look very strange.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way around that. And when the federal government claims they're not involved in something, 9 times out of 10 you can say they most certainly are. So They know what's going on, and
They know what's, yeah, they're
yeah,
not going to shoot them. They're ours. Why would we shoot them down?
yeah, and I know that they've been very finger wagging about, oh, don't shoot them down, it's dangerous, blah blah blah. But once again, even putting on side the question of firearm safety, it's very bizarre. And like I said, considering the adamant denial of the federal government, I have little reason to believe that they're not involved in this. It also does beg the question, assuming this is the Iranian mothership and that they are plotting their final attack against America. Has almost
Mm.
3 years of war in Ukraine taught us nothing? Has the Armenia-Azerbaijan war in Nagorno-Karabakh taught us nothing? Has the almost 2 decades of war in Syria taught us nothing about electronic warfare and drones?
Yeah, yeah.
Assuming this were some sort of malicious force against us, which once again I don't think it is. I think this is the feds all the way down, as I had said earlier. Uh, Either we're lacking or they're planning something. In which case, like I
Yeah.
said, I think they're just gay upping the population because this is just the kind of stuff that they do.
Yes.
But ultimately, this is probably going to end one day and never be talked about again. Much like the
The
balloons.
Chinese balloons,
Yeah,
yeah.
maybe I don't know. Maybe the F-22 will get a second ever recorded kill after missing a shot and landing a missile in Lake Michigan.
That's right.
That could be the case. But with that being said, I suppose we should talk about the monumental geopolitical ramifications of the annexation of Canada as proposed by Donald Trump multiple times. So, not being satisfied with Greenland, he has moved on that Canada is the 51st state and that Justin Trudeau is the wonderful governor of the great 51st state of Canada. And that
Yes.
they're actually, beyond Trump nonsense, beyond his Twitter antics, there have been substantial proposals to the Canadians, such as equalization of currency exchange rates and just knocking down a lot of these barriers that are just unthinkable. And while I do think, obviously, the 51st state thing is just Trump's rhetoric, I do think they are pushing for a greater North American integration, especially when it
Yeah.
comes to economically. How Mexico plays into this, I think that's an entirely different question. But in terms of American Canadian unification, I don't think they're going to create a union state between America and Canada. Let me be clear, but I do think that they want a more, for lack of a better example, European style arrangement between the two. Not that the two aren't already attached to the hip and that borders are practically open between the two already. But in terms of a lot of the economic barriers, I think that they are trying to break that down. I think the Americans are trying to solidify the home base, as it were. And I know that there has been a lot of Chinese money in Canada as of late, and of course a lot of Indian money as well. But I do think, given how monumental the shifts are across the world, that Washington wants complete dominion over the North American
Yes.
continent, even more than it already has, and that uh, they want to break down those last barriers with the Canadians, and that they want that full integration, and they want it now. And that is something that they're not going to relent on, and that frankly the Canadians are probably going to accept because there's really not many other options. And like I said, I'm under no illusion that we're going to get the 51st state or any sort of formal political integration, but there is going to be uh, like I said, a very European Union style arrangement. I think that they are going to push a. I know what's the NAFTA replacement? It's like the U.S. The like the CAMX-US, like where they it's just the
Yeah.
two letters of the country. And like I said, I think the Mexico question is entirely different subject that is going to certainly be addressed, especially with some of the cartel violence and how that increases in the question of a so-called intervention in Mexico. But definitely between Anglosphere North America and I suppose the French tag-alongs up in Quebec, they are going to push hard for further integration, and that they are going to seal any gaps that I think particularly worried about any sort of Chinese money or influence in Canada, that they want to seal that off, and they want to have that integrated North American sphere, especially in the face of a very dynamic and unstable world.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Americans also want fresh water.
Yeah,
That's like one of the biggest imports uh, that they have
energy
from
too,
us.
with the
Yeah,
question of the pipelines and natural gas, especially.
yeah.
Uh, And
Yeah, I mean, I could see it. I mean, there were people at work talking about it, and I said, I mean, they already own us anyways. Like, yeah,
the greatest argument against annexing Canada, we get all the Indians.
yeah.
uh,
Imagine 100 years from now, there is going to be a war between the Hindus and the Sikhs. It'll be
fought
like
over
18,
convenience store chains, right?
it'll be 2112 instead of 1812.
uh, who could forget the 7-Eleven campaign? But I
Yeah.
digress. But yeah, with that being said, in terms of freshwater energy cooperation and the fact that Trudeau is likely to be knocked out of power soon, whether by his own party or the fact that an election certainly needs to be called. At the very latest, the Canadians are going to have an election in the fall of 2025, and that, to my understanding, you could probably speak better to your country of residence than I can. It's expected. It heavily favors the Conservatives. Is that correct?
Yeah, it does. I
And
mean, they are way ahead. They
to
are
my
at least
understanding,
twice that of the Liberals.
when it comes to American Canadian relations, if there were to be any sort of large integration push, it would be from the Conservatives, correct?
Hmm. Like even Native Canadians, in like Indian Canadians, it's virtually 2-1 preference for the Conservatives. I mean, I think a lot of people wanted Trudeau to lose those years back when he went for a second term. Um, I
2019,
mean,
2021. I remember we did
yeah,
cover
yeah,
those.
yeah. I
Uh,
mean, I don't know. I think what's his name? The other guy. He's a complete cuck.
what, Polyev or something.
Yeah, whatever. He's an idiot too. Like,
I haven't seen much of him, but what I have seen, it's what you'd expect from Anglosphere conservatism.
yeah. Did you see him at that Jewish celebration where
Oh, I thought you
he,
were gonna say one of the million Sikh rallies he went to.
yeah, he says that he's so proud to be an honorary Jew or something. It's so cringe. It's so cringeworthy. He's like a typical Republican American. Like,
Fit right
it's
with
just,
Lindsey Graham, I understand.
yeah. It's,
But yeah, it is going to be interesting, and I do think that once again, on from both the perspective of Ottawa and Washington, despite maybe some of the murmurs from up north that North American integration on an effective level, not even necessarily a formal level, but on an effective level, is already happened and is going to continue further, and it's just a foregone conclusion. And honestly, this might sound strange. I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. I think if they're pushing for that much solidification of power, it can only spell trouble in the future. That they
yeah.
are
I
preparing
mean,
for something.
if you can stop like various candidates like Georgescu that we talked about last week, like it's a centralization of power, right? W- w- like I don't know. America was more confident before. Like, why do you need to do that? Why do you need to blow up Germany's pipe? Like, there's a hurriedness that you sense, right? That's why there's always like a sense of something is terribly impending. And like as you say, if you have to incorporate Canada as like a de facto 51st state, then
Then what are you preparing for?
yeah, exactly, what are you preparing
Much
for?
like if you're withdrawing from Afghanistan, what are you preparing for? And we figured out that was Ukraine.
Yeah,
And usually, when the American empire, when Washington takes those kind of moves, it spells that something else is going to be in the near future. And
yeah,
I'm not looking forward to it. And this is just beyond my personal principles. But full disclosure, I've said for a number of years that my opinion towards North America is that both Canada and the U.S. need heavy federalization, that there needs to be a heavy regionalization. I mean, just for the sake of interest of people like us, that that
yeah,
is how you win political victories, is you uh, transfer the power back to regional governments, regional elites. But that's aside the point. But if they are pushing this hard for integration, where they're effectively trying to annex Canada even more than they already have, it's it, it only spells troubled times, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's all I had for this
It's like
episode.
saying,
Yeah,
"Oh, the fresh water is costing too much."
yeah,
I
that's
get.
like why is it all of a sudden a problem if
Hmm.
we've had cooperation
Hmm.
for years? Why are the oil and gas pipelines all of a sudden a problem if we've seamlessly cooperated on them for years? Clearly, something else is at play here. And
Absolutely.
memes aside, Trump's bloviating aside, and that also brings in the Greenland question. Why focusing so much on the integration of Greenland? And I think a lot of people, when they look at the flat map, forget that yes, there's the North Pole, there is the North, and North America and Russia are actually very close to each other if you go north,
Yeah, yeah.
especially in missile flight paths, especially in air defense systems. And if there were to be a nuclear war or even a conventional war, that they don't need to fire missiles across Europe in order to hit it. They can go up and over. And like I said, looking at a 2D map, I think a lot of people lose that perspective, but it is very much the case that I know this might turn off some of our viewers. We live on a globe, but and that also presents security challenges, and especially if we believe the reports that the Arctic Circle is thawing, it is a race for who can control those sea routes, and I think that's another big part of that. Looking forward into the coming decades.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I mean, Trump could be doing this. He could annex Canada just to, to piss off Tom Hanks and Whoopi Goldberg.
oh no, they might have to choose another. Liberals
Yeah,
might have to have another ace up their sleeve
yeah.
because it. One last thing I'll say for this episode is it is bizarre for the Bush era liberals how things have turned around. They can't idolize the Europeans because they're all poor and racist. Canada is about to be annexed, so they can't do that anymore. What's going to be their juxtaposition to America? What is going to be their counterweight to the stupid middle American bigots? What exists anymore? You can't
Hmm.
because, like I said, the Europeans are all poor and racist now, and Canada doesn't exist. They have nothing. What are they going to appeal to Mexico? I did see one. I hate to admit it. I was watching some slop a few weeks back, and it was street interviews. I can't remember how exactly I came across it, but in my shame, I admit I watched it, and it was election related. And it was one of the people said that if Trump wins, they were going to leave the country. And one of the countries this woman said was India would be one of her options.
Oh God.
It's like how bad does it have to be where you're kind of like what are you saying? Why in
Yeah.
like yeah, you can pick Canada, you can pick anywhere in Europe, you can pick all the Scandinavian Disneyland countries that we love to idolize so much, but India, like I gotta give credit for originality. I've never heard somebody threaten to move to India. But that's an entirely different question. But did you have any last minute additions?
No, that's about it for me.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into yet another episode of the War Report. We covered a lot of ground. I think we rounded out the show. Definitely much. We've returned to the tone of the show that our last regular episode simply did not have. Because yes, once again, the George McMillan episode was great. I'd love to once again recreate that in the future. But the episode we did before that, it was very bleak. I know, especially with a lot of the news out of Syria.
Hmm.
So I'm glad we found our footing with that again, and this isn't just going to be the Black Pill report. Which I mean, full disclosure, some parts of it will be, some parts of it always will be, but it is my effort, despite how bad the situation gets, not to just turn the show into the Black Pill report and just do stuff like we did this last 10 minutes of the show. Um, but thank you everyone for tuning in once again, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.